Chapter 971. If the Central Plains were the battlefield, Jiang Pengji could defend the city walls and avoid facing the cavalry head-on. She could use other methods to attack the north borderline. But now, the northern border was the main battlefield. With such a wide terrain, it was a paradise for cavalry to come and go as they pleased. If the northern borderline wanted to do this, there was a very important premise. They have so many cavalrymen. Ever since the horse plague a few years ago, the northern borderline's cavalry had suffered a great blow and were unable to recover. The royal court of the northern borderline colluded with the Meng family of Zhengzhou to purchase mares at a high price, which greatly increased the production of foals. However, it also took time to domesticate the foals. Jiang Pengji took advantage of the time difference. She chose the most awkward time for the northern borderline to send her troops, forcing the northern borderline to fight in a sorry state. At that moment, it was unknown how many nobles of the northern borderline were cursing Jiang Pengji's ancestors. Of all the times to start the battle, they had to choose this timing. Otherwise, they could wait for the northern borderline to recover more than half of its vitality. At that time they could fight openly. If they had done it earlier, the northern borderline would not have suffered such a big loss. The money saved from the deal with the Mengs could have been invested in the expansion of the army. Now, the vitality of the northern borderline had not been restored in time, and the money that had been invested was also wasted. Lu Shi has gone too far. The 9th prince was so angry that he tore up the secret report. Damn it, she actually dared to hit him. But that woman actually used their 2nd prince as a sacrifice. When had the northern borderline suffered such grievances? When had he ever been slapped in the face like this? Acting king, I am willing to lead the army to repel that traitor Lu. Not only was Wu Liba the wise man of the northern borderline, but he was also one of the few wise generals of the northern borderline. He was experienced in commanding and was fully qualified to lead an army. However, the 9th prince was wary of the master-disciple relationship between Wu Liba and the 3rd prince. He did not dare to relinquish his military power and chose another person to be the commander-in-chief with Wu Liba as his assistant. Because the king of the northern borderline suffered a stroke and was paralyzed, he was unable to handle the court affairs. The 9th prince succeeded as the acting king and temporarily took over the duties of the king of the northern borderline. Whether or not Wu Liba could become the commander-in-chief still required the approval of the 9th prince. The result did not need to be said. Wu Liba had volunteered and received this result. Naturally, he was indignant. Although he was indignant, now was not the time to be calculative about personal gains and losses. The most important thing at the moment was to repel the invading thief Lu. Even so, when Wu Liba found out who the commander-in-chief of the 3 armies was, he was so angry that his eyes turned red. The commander was none other than Wu Liba's political enemy, Herencha, who had assisted the 9th prince in becoming the acting king. When enemies meet, their eyes turn red. Herencha and Wu Liba were definitely incompatible like fire and water. It would already be good if they did not drag each other down. How could he expect them to advance together? The 9th prince did not notice the exchange of glances between Herencha and Wu Liba, and suddenly threw out a bomb. I intend to personally lead the army to boost the morale of the 3 armies. Personally lead the army? *T. Herencha and Wu Liba cursed in their hearts in unison. Was this bastard trying to stir up trouble? Don't you know what it means to be out in the field and not to obey the sovereign's orders? Putting everything else aside, the 9th prince was the acting king. After he personally led the army into battle, would the army obey the commander-in-chief or him? The 9th prince wasn't even as good as the 2nd prince, let alone leading troops to war. At least the 2nd prince had the experience of conquering tribes, but the 9th prince knew nothing at all. Taking 10,000 steps back, the 9th prince arrived at the front line and didn't do anything. He generously handed over the military power to the commander-in-chief and didn't interfere in the war. That wouldn't do either. The swords on the battlefield had no eyes. If the 9th prince was caught by the enemy, would he be helping or causing trouble? For the first time, Wu Liba and Herencha reached a consensus to stop the 9th prince. Acting king, personally leading the army concerns the fate of the nation. Please think twice before acting. If they could win, it wouldn't be a problem. If they lost, the acting king would be captured or killed. Regardless of whether he was dead or alive, it would be a huge blow to the morale of the northern borderline. No matter how one looked at it, the current northern borderline had not reached the point where the acting king needed to personally lead the army. This matter could be avoided if possible. The two of them didn't know that the ninth prince wanted to lead the army personally because he had a guilty conscience. If all the troops were transferred to the front line, he would be in charge of the imperial court. This meant that the number of troops protecting him would be greatly reduced. If his brothers joined forces to launch a sneak attack on the imperial court, wouldn't he be dead for sure? Rather than that, he might as well follow to the front line. On one hand, he could boost the morale of the three armies. On the other hand, he could control the various generals and reduce the number of collusions and disagreements in the entire army. If he could defeat Lu Shi, he might be able to be promoted from acting king to a true king. The first time he led the army personally, he achieved a great victory. What did this mean? It meant that he was the king of the northern borderline chosen by the great god of the grasslands, the Lord of Destiny. Apart from Haruncha and Wu Liba, the other ministers suggested one after another. Their intentions were similar. Stay in the imperial court and don't run around. Leave the war to the adults. You'd better dig in the mud obediently. The ninth prince was furious when he heard this. He insisted on leading the army personally. No one could persuade him otherwise. The arm could not twist the thigh. The ninth prince insisted on leading the army personally. Wu Liba and Haruncha could only agree with a gloomy face. Anyway, the king had more than one son. Without the ninth prince, there was still a string of princes waiting to take the throne. The northern borderline was vast. Most of it was flat grasslands, gobi, glaciers, swamps, and deserts. It seemed quiet, but it was actually full of danger. After leaving the checkpoint at the border of the northern borderline in Dongqing, the further north they went, the flatter the terrain and the wider the field of vision. Although Sun Wen had not stayed in the northern borderline for a long time, he had done his homework. It was as if he had lived in the northern borderline for decades. Zhang Pengji listened to his suggestions carefully. She considered whether to adopt or improve them. The further we go, the more open the terrain will be. The mountains will be flat. This place is very suitable for the cavalry to assemble and charge. According to the news from the scouts, they have already set up camp by the Yi River. This place is rich in water and the terrain is open. It's not easy to launch a sneak attack. Zhang Pengji led the vanguard battalion and the cavalry to their destination. The rest of the troops and logistics would need another day to arrive. Yi River? Zhang Pengji stared at the river on the map in a daze. The northern borderline has set up camp by the water? Sun Wen was puzzled. He said, according to the scouts, that is indeed the case. Setting up a camp was also very particular. The choice of the location of the camp and the distribution of the camp was a skill. Not only did they have to consider the size and position of each camp to achieve the purpose of resisting the enemy's sneak attack, but they also had to consider how to quickly transmit information and ensure that the news on the battlefield was transmitted quickly. Apart from that, there had to be a clean water source near the camp. Zhang Pengji frowned. She asked Sun Wen, Zidao, do you know the length and width of the Yi River and its source? Sun Wen was a smart man. Zhang Pengji didn't have to ask too clearly for him to guess part of it. Feng Zhan, who was beside her, had a lot of ideas. He also figured it out. My lord, do you mean to cut off their water source? I'm afraid that won't work. They know the distribution of water in the northern borderline better than we do. If we cut off this river, they can still choose another one. We can't defend against it. The water source in the northern borderline wasn't abundant, but it wasn't the time of extreme water shortage. It was just the beginning of spring. As spring and summer approached, the glaciers upstream would melt, and the river would become more abundant. Sun Wen frowned. Could it be poisoning? Chapter 972. Wen Qiguan Rang and Wei Ci were rushing over with the main force. At this moment, the two of them were not in the tent. Sun Wen frowned when he heard this. If it wasn't poisoning or cutting off the water, then... My lord, you mean the flood? What was a flood? The live stream viewers gave a clearer answer. Gue Kai Gua Feng Shao, Ling Sun? It's more common here in the Yellow River. Generally, it was because the lower section of the river was frozen or the ice dam formed by the accumulation of ice, causing the river to be blocked and causing the river to rise. If it was light, it would cause the river to flood, but if it was heavy, it would cause the dam to break and cause a disaster. Cafeteria Daffin Auntie. I realize that our streamer is becoming more and more witty. I feel like the retarded Bei Jiang is going to die soon. Da Jiang marries me. No, if it's a man-made flood, the host is now downstream. Is she going to drown herself? How is that possible? Jiang Pengji wanted to crush her opponent to death, not dig a hole to bury herself. Now that the weather is so cold, it will take at least a month for the snow to melt. The Yi River was wide and long, with a large difference in height between the upper and lower reaches. It flowed through all the major tribes in the northern borderland. If we can create a man-made ice flood and prevent the Yi River from flooding, that would be a great idea. The northern borderline was a nomadic people. They lived by water, and wherever there was a water source and abundant grass, they would go there. In other words, if the Yi River burst its dike, the northern borderline tribes near the Yi River would suffer. At this time, a spectator in the live stream remembered a detail and quickly asked in the live stream. Xie Xingchen, streamer, I've carefully looked at the map of the north borderline and Dongqing. It seems that the water of the Yong River will flow into the territory of Dongqing, right? If the upstream Yi River burst its dike and flooded, would the water flow in Dongqing be affected? It wasn't a problem to flood the northern borderline, but he didn't want to drown his own family. Regarding this problem, Jiang Pengji was not very worried. Dongqing's water veins were crisscrossed and were quite developed. The overflowing water from the Yi River gushed into Dongqing. After many divergences, the impact was not great. Feng Zhan rubbed his chin and said, even so, the three tribes of the north borderline have lived here for a long time. How could they not even know about Ling Sun? The herdsmen of the northern borderline were very dependent on this water source. Their ancestors had been dealing with this river for generations. If the people of Dongqing depended on the heavens to eat, then the people of the north borderline depended on the rivers to eat. Once the river dries up or floods overflow, the tribes living along the river will suffer. If there were any changes in the Yi River, they would definitely be able to detect it immediately. They were far more experienced than them. Sun Wen furrowed his brows and said, Zishir's worries are not without reason. If their intentions were discovered by the enemy one step ahead of them, no matter how powerful the plan was, it would be greatly reduced and would not be able to achieve the desired effect. The reason why he was able to achieve such an unexpected result was because the information on both sides was not on the same level. Feng Zhan looked at the Yi River channel with a thoughtful expression. His eyes narrowed slightly, and there seemed to be a flash of inspiration in them. The Yi River was not the only river in the northern borderline. If they were to occupy the upstream to intercept the water, no matter how stupid they were, they would not stay in the same place. Based on the northern borderline's understanding and rich experience of the Yi River, it was quite possible for them to discover the preemptive opportunity to create a man-made ice flood. Once they lost the initiative, their advantage would turn into a disadvantage. In that case, it would be better to cut off the water upstream to ensure the normal flow of the Black River and store water upstream at the same time? When this idea popped up, Feng Zhen couldn't help but think in that direction. As he thought about it, he simulated the feasibility of it. After a while, Feng Zhen said, there really is a plan. While Jiang Pengji and the others were discussing in the tent, the northern borderline camp was also in a heated debate. After all, the northern borderline was fighting on their home ground. The speed at which they gathered their troops and set up camp was much faster than Jiang Pengji's. The scouts returned with news. Jiang Pengji's army was gathering 20 miles away from the camp. The main force had not arrived yet. Hearing this news, Wu Liba's entire body trembled. He hurriedly stepped forward to speak. The Lu clan has a large number of soldiers and generals. I heard that the soldiers in the tent are all elites who have been meticulously trained. If we allow their 100,000-strong army to gather, they will certainly be a great threat to us. In my opinion, the acting king should give the order. While the Lu clan's army has not arrived, we should attack first and catch them off guard. As long as we successfully defeat their elite vanguard, the morale of the Lu clan's army will be greatly reduced. In ancient wars, morale was one of the key factors that determined the outcome of a war. If morale was high, even eunuchs could chase hens. If morale was low, 3 to 5 strong men could be chased by rookies. As long as they defeated Jiang Pengji's elite vanguard and severely damaged her morale, would the warriors of the northern borderline be afraid of her 100,000 elites? I forgot to mention that during a war, the armies of both sides like to report their numbers. An army of 1,000,000 might only have a little more than 500,000, rounded up to 1,000,000. The northern borderline claimed to have 500,000 men, But in reality, there were only 180,000 of them. Among them, 80,000 of the militia were conscripted at the last minute. The Lu clan had raised the flag of 150,000 men. Judging by one's own strength, perhaps there were only 50,000 or 60,000. Wu Liba's suggestion was more sensible. Although the combat power of the northern borderline's cavalry was less than 30% of its peak, they were not afraid of sneak attacks. Unfortunately, Wu Liba had a political enemy, the commander-in-chief. Heartfelt would not agree to his suggestion. Heartfelt suggested that the acting king defend and not fight. They should wait for the Lu clan's troops to weaken and their morale to drop before waiting for an opportunity to counterattack. After all, the acting king was personally leading the army. If they attacked rashly and the king's safety was threatened, who would bear the responsibility? How could they switch from defense to offense? Wu Liba's face was ashen. He cursed Heartfelt in his heart. Defend my ass. Lu Shi's vanguard only had about 20,000 to 30,000 men. How could they be afraid with such a small number of people? Go home and find your mother to drink milk. Wu Liba was so angry that he wanted to flip the table. However, he did not have the final say in the camp, much less Heartfelt. It was the acting king who had the final say. Because the ninth prince was afraid of death, he wanted to lead the army personally to prevent his brothers from ambushing him while the imperial court was empty. However, he was still afraid of death when he reached the army camp. He was afraid that the general in charge of the military would lead the troops to rebel against him. In order to restrict everyone's military power, he directly gave a stupid order. Any military advance or retreat must be reported to the higher-ups, and must not act arbitrarily. What did this mean? In layman's terms, it was, all matters of war, no matter how big or small, had to be told to him and let him make the decision. You guys can't make the decision yourselves. F***CK. F***CK. Hearing this order, Heartfelt and Wu Liba felt their balls ache. Did they not know what fleeting opportunities meant? Everything had to be done with the acting king's approval. Lu Shi had already led his troops to attack the Yellow Dragon and stab the imperial court. The acting king did not care what they thought. The world was big, but his own safety was the most important. What Heartfelt said made sense. He was conservative and steady, but Wu Liba's suggestion was also very tempting. The acting king had just taken office and his prestige was not stable. He urgently needed a victory to establish his prestige, no matter how big or small. This matter, let me think about it. I will give you an answer in 2 hours at the earliest. Wu Liba. 2 hours? Hurry my ass. Chapter 973. The E River was one of the top rivers in the northern borderland. The width of the E River near the camp of the northern frontier was more than 5 miles, which was about 2,500 meters. Jiang Pengji's army was stationed on the east bank of E River, while the army of the northern borderline was stationed on the west bank. The two armies faced each other across the river. Wu Liba suggested that the acting king take advantage of the time when Jiang Pengji's vanguard battalion had just arrived and had yet to converge with the main army to forcefully cross the river and launch a sneak attack. Heartfelt, however, made a completely opposite suggestion. He hoped to hold their ground and not fight, waiting for the enemy's morale to weaken before fighting again. The former made sense and poked the acting king's itch, but the latter was more reliable. The acting king hesitated for a moment. There's no point in scheming with him. Wu Liba left the commander's tent. He was so angry that his eyes turned black and he almost vomited blood. Why were the sons of the ambitious king of the northern borderline so afraid of death? Heartfelt's back foot came out. He laughed coldly. Congratulations in advance, General Wu Liba. I'm afraid that the king will accept your suggestion. Wu Liba secretly clenched his fists, resisting the urge to punch Heartfelt's face. This old fellow's words were too sarcastic. Traitor Lu is no ordinary person. He has countless advisors around him. If I miss this opportunity, 2 hours later, the acting king will agree to switch from defense to offense. I'm afraid that Traitor Lu has already prepared a countermeasure. The battlefield was ever-changing. If he missed this opportunity, he might lose. Jiang Pengji led the vanguard battalion to the east bank of the E River. There were only slightly more than 30,000 troops, so they could be completely annihilated. The 30,000-strong vanguard army had experienced a long journey and had exhausted a lot of their physical strength. This was the moment when their combat power was at its weakest. If they had accepted his suggestion earlier, they might have been able to cross the river and launch a sneak attack under the cover of the morning mist. Now, wait another 2 hours? Even if the acting king agreed, it would still take 2 hours for the troops to cross the river. If the efficiency was lower, it might even take 4 hours. By that time, the mist on the surface of the river would have dispersed. Would they be able to cross the river and launch a sneak attack? This was like sending a moving human target to the enemy. They could sit down and have a picnic, eat breakfast, and take a nap. While they were at it, they could get into formation to face the enemy. Sneak attack? Wu Liba resisted the urge to vomit blood. F***ck, I really can't carry these stupid teammates. Even if he was fully equipped, he would not be able to carry it. When he said 2 hours, he meant 2 hours, not a second more or less. The acting king's choice dilemma flared up. After wasting 2 hours, he finally made up his mind to follow Wu Liba's suggestion and cross the river to launch a sneak attack. With regards to this, Wu Liba could only chuckle in response. On the surface he chuckled, but on the inside he was cursing. If Wu Liba's opponent was not Zhang Pengji but someone else, he might still be able to make it. Unfortunately, Wu Liba's opponent was Zhang Pengji. The strategists under Zhang Pengji were all shrewd. Looking around, he realized that he was surrounded by useless teammates. Looking at his opponents, they were all gods. We've already missed the golden opportunity. Let's wait for nightfall. Wu Liba swallowed the thick phlegm that was rolling down his throat. He had no choice but to restrain himself. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would grab the acting king's shoulder and spit this thick phlegm on the other party's face. The mist on the surface of the river has already dispersed. Sneak attacks won't be of much use. On the east bank of the Yi River, in the Lu family's camp, Zhang Pengji and a few strategists spread out cloth on the banks of the Yishui River for a picnic. Feng Zhen was still happily drinking wine. Zai Dao has foresight. They really didn't cross the river for a sneak attack. At first, he saw traces of troop movements in the enemy's main camp. Then, it became quiet again. It was obvious that they had given up on crossing the river for a sneak attack. TSK, it made him nervous for a while. Sun Wen looked at the scene in front of him. He resisted the twitching of his eyebrows and said expressionlessly, if Wu Liba was the commander-in-chief and the acting king of the northern borderline didn't personally lead the army into battle, or if he chose to delegate power to Wu Liba, I'm afraid that the army of the northern borderline would have crossed the river more than 2 hours ago. If that was the case, why would they still be eating breakfast by the river? But the reality is that the acting king of the northern borderline is personally leading the army into battle, and the commander-in-chief is Wu Liba's political enemy. I can't take it anymore, I'm laughing so hard my stomach hurts. Feng Zhen laughed and almost choked on the wine. He had no choice but to laugh. Wu Liba, the wise man of the northern borderline, was too pitiful. If Wu Liba could seize the opportunity to cross the river and launch a sneak attack, even if the troops were prepared, they might be caught unprepared. They might not be completely annihilated, but it was inevitable that they would suffer some losses. Don't think that suffering a small loss was nothing. If the main forces of the two armies suffered a small loss before the battle began, the morale of the army would drop by a large margin. Sun Wen had been a multifaceted spy in the northern borderline. He had thoroughly studied the temperaments of the main characters. No matter how powerful Wu Liba was, he was bound to be tricked by a group of arrogant and stupid teammates who would only hold him back. Don't be arrogant in victory, don't be discouraged in defeat. Moreover, we haven't won yet. It's not time for us to be arrogant. Zhang Pengji warned Feng Zhen to prevent him from acting recklessly. She said calmly, we missed this opportunity today, but there's another one tonight. Be careful. If they still didn't launch a sneak attack at night. Not to mention Feng Zhen, she would also pity Wu Liba. Zhang Pengji smiled and squinted her eyes. She said, all right, how are things going on Zixiao's side? Feng Zhen restrained the wanton look on his face, and a glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. Rest assured, my lord. The timing is just right. If wisdom is not enough, then we'll conquer it with force, Zhang Pengji said. Tonight, we'll teach the northern borderline how to fight a war. If wisdom was not enough, then we'll conquer it with force? Teach the northern borderline how to fight a war? In terms of arrogance, there was probably no one more arrogant than this lord. Sun Wen thought about it silently. Zhang Pengji didn't like to waste time in battles. Her biggest characteristic was her rapid pace. If the quality of the soldiers she led was average, an overly fast pace would easily cause the order of the battle to be disjointed, and they would become a burden instead. It was different now. Her soldiers had been painstakingly trained for several years. Apart from training every day, they were the elites of the elites. In the words of the audience in the streaming room, even in the Hua Nation's army, their average standard was above average. To Jiang Pengji, they were still a group of rookies, but to this era, they were mighty troops that would shock the world. They had kept a low profile, bided their time, and trained their horses and soldiers for several years, just waiting for today's battle. Jiang Pengji led 30,000 vanguards to the battlefield. According to her usual thinking, the rest of the main force should only arrive in 3 or 4 days. Most of the vanguard battalion was cavalry. They were fast and mobile. Most of the main force was infantry and logistics, so their speed was naturally slow. Little did they know that Jiang Pengji wasn't someone who played her cards according to logic. At this moment, the surface of Yishui Lake was dark. A thin fog gradually rose, and both sides of the lake were shrouded in the dark night. It was the time when people were sound asleep and their alertness was at its lowest. Jiang Pengji sat in the main tent with her eyes closed. She seemed to be taking a nap. The audience in the streaming room was bored and sent bullet screens, imagining the future. Chongqing Luoyue. If the streamer becomes the Empress who unifies the world in the end, will today's battle be recorded in the history books? Kakara. It definitely will. This is Yishui in the northern borderline. Maybe it will be the famous Battle of Yishui? Xiaoshuo Wushuang. Battle of Yishui? No, isn't this name too perfunctory? The audience chatted on and off. The voice of Li Yun, the captain of the vanguard battalion, sounded from outside the tent. Chapter 974. 1. Jiang Pengji, who was resting with her eyes closed, suddenly opened her eyes when she heard the commotion. Her dark eyes flashed with a cold light. As she got up, she picked up the long sword on her knees with her right hand and carried it on her shoulder. Han Mei, let's go! She opened the tent flap and saw a young general in armor standing to the side. His mature face had lost its childish look and was full of masculinity. Jiang Pengji was also wearing armor and looked like she was going to the battlefield to kill the enemy. The strategists beside her had already given up on treating her. No matter how they persuaded her, their lord was not willing to be a quiet princess in the main tent of the Central Army. The way she carried a horse-slaying sword and fought bravely against the enemy made even the chief commander, Fu Wang, fearful. They were also in despair. Others hoped that their lord could do more, but they only hoped that their lord could be more vigilant. The Yi River has been foggy for 15 minutes. Even if we light a fire, we won't be able to see clearly from 300 steps away. Li Yun saw Jiang Pengji walk out of the main tent and hurriedly followed. He said as he walked, "The two strategists feel that the time is ripe. In less than an hour, the enemy will surely disembark." Only 3 days had passed since the first day of the lunar calendar. There was only a small crescent moon in the sky. The moonlight was dim and gloomy. Because of the weather, dark clouds covered the sky. The few rays of moonlight were also obscured. The visibility on the ground was very low. In Wu Liba's view, God was also helping him. The opportunity did not come again. He could not let go of such a great opportunity. Don't be careless. Wu Liba is a rare wise general in the northern borderline. He is very experienced. Whether it is you or the gentleman, the path you have taken has been too smooth compared to others. Precisely because of this, you should always be vigilant. Jiang Pengji trusted her strategists, but she would not blindly trust them. Compared to Wu Liba, who had rich experience in war, whether it was the late bloomer Sun Wen or the crafty Feng Zhan, they were no match for Wu Liba in terms of experience. Wu Liba had suffered at Jiang Pengji's hands before. The night attack on the shore this time would not be easy to deal with. Li Yun looked like he had learned something. His little tail that had just been raised drooped down obediently. We know that it is highly likely that Wu Liba will cross the river tonight and launch a sneak attack. However, we do not know when he will arrive or from which direction. Now, we can only deal with the changes by not changing, instructing the vanguard camp to be on their toes and not slack off at all. Jiang Pengji met up with Feng Zhan and the others. When she arrived, Feng Zhan and Jiang Nongqin, the commandant of the female battalion, were discussing in a low voice. Sun Wenza, who was beside them, frowned deeply. "Greetings, my lord." The three of them bowed in unison. "No need to be so polite. How are the preparations?" Jiang Nongqin said in a low voice. "Your Highness, we're almost ready. We're just waiting for the movement on the river." She was 1 year older than Jiang Pengji's current body. As half of Jiang Pengji's disciple and the first female general under Jiang Pengji's command, the pressure on her was far greater than anyone could imagine. In the few years that Jiang Pengji had been conserving her energy, Jiang Nongqin had also been working hard to enrich herself. She studied military books and practiced diligently. In the past 2 years, she had also developed from a simple general to a scholar and a martial artist. As a woman, her reputation in the military camp was second only to Fu Wang and Meng Hun. She was on par with Li Yun and slightly better than Dian Yan. Jiang Nongqin's contributions could not go unnoticed for the female battalion to be able to develop a scale of 20,000 combat elites and 4,000 medical soldiers. Jiang Pengji looked at the pitch-black surface of the river with a grave expression. Although they had made sufficient preparations, the vanguard battalion only had 30,000 troops. Even if they were all elites, they could not withstand the large number of enemies. "I'm afraid it will be a tough battle tonight. No matter what, we have to hold on for a few days. Rest assured, my lord. I will definitely fight to the end." A woman's voice was either as gentle as water or as clear as a silver bell. Jiang Nongqin's voice was like a blood-stained knife. Every word was filled with murderous intent. Although she did not have a stocky build, when she stood there, she looked like a sharp spear. After half an hour, the fog on the surface of the river became thicker. "It's here." The female soldiers of the vanguard battalion sent back news that a large number of fireflies had appeared on the surface of the river and were approaching the east bank. As time passed, the number of fireflies increased. Through the thick fog, these moving fireflies could be seen from far to near, from small to large, like fireflies. In the dark night, it looked very horrifying. Jiang Nongqin's expression was solemn. She seemed to have thought of something. She said to Sun Wen, military advisor Sun, "I'm afraid it's a trap." Sun Wen smiled and said, "Captain Jiang, you're right. It's indeed a trap." It was obviously a sneak attack. Why did he light a torch in the thin fog? Was he trying to deceive himself? Wu Liba was an old general with rich combat experience. He was best at seizing the opportunity. His arrangements were even more meticulous and experienced. How could such a person overlook such a huge flaw? Although the fog on the surface of the river is thick, since it's a sneak attack, why did he light a torch? Was he afraid that others would not notice him? I think that Wu Liba did this on purpose. He wanted us to focus our attention on this area. He thought that he would land here and launch a sneak attack. This is the first reason. Sun Wen wore a smile on his face. Even though the fireflies on the surface of the river were approaching the shore, he remained motionless. Secondly, the foreign tribes of the north borderline live by water. A mere river is nothing to them. Even if they did not light a torch and the water surface is no more than 5 miles wide, they would be able to cross the river smoothly. In summary, this should be a deliberate decoy. We must not fall for it. Sun Wen spoke calmly. What he wanted to say was exactly what Jiang Nongqin was thinking. Who would shout before a sneak attack, "Don't hide, I'm coming to attack you"? Even so, ordinary people are still easily fooled. The atmosphere of war could make people tense up and often cause them to overlook certain details. Jiang Nongqin sighed and said, "Unfortunately, the river is cold now. If it were summer, Wu Liba might be able to make you suffer a little." Sun Wen looked at Jiang Nongqin in surprise. "Please give me some pointers, Captain Jiang." Seeing Sun Wen's reaction, Jiang Nongqin said uneasily, "I can't say that I'm giving pointers. I just feel that the foreign tribes of the north borderline know the river like the back of their hands. Their swimming skills should not be weak either. If it were summer, the river would not be so cold. Perhaps people could use the hull of the boat as a cover to cross the river." Although Jiang Nongqin's imagination was wild, it was not impossible. When encountering a meticulous person like Sun Wen, he would definitely think that the appearance of a torch on the boat on the river was a feint by the enemy. Little did he know that the enemy was hiding under the shadow of the boat. If they crossed the river, they would be caught off guard. "Lieutenant Jiang, you've taught this old man a lesson." "Thank you." Sun Wen bowed with his hands folded in front. He valued Jiang Nongqin even more. Jiang Nongqin was just saying. She was experienced in war and training, but she was still an intern when it came to giving advice. She had IQ and knowledge but lacked actual combat experience. Jiang Pengji asked Sun Wen to help Jiang Nongqin because she wanted Sun Wen to give her some pointers. Seeing that the fireflies on the surface of the river had entered their shooting range, Sun Wen ordered to use a rocket to test the waters. Chapter 975. 1. An empty boat was the right choice. Wu Liba placed a straw doll on the boat and lit a torch, trying to attract the attention of Jiang Pengji's side. If it was someone else, they would most likely be fooled. Even if they did not shoot arrows wildly, they would gather a group of troops and wait by the river bank. As long as Jiang Pengji's main force was deployed there, Wu Liba's goal of creating a diversion would be achieved. However, Wu Liba's opponent was Sun Wen, a late bloomer who had once toyed with the northern borderline's imperial court. Sun Wen was cautious and meticulous. He would fully understand his opponent until he could analyze them thoroughly. As the wise man of the northern borderline, Wu Liba was an important target for Sun Wen's careful analysis. Once the enemy analyzed it thoroughly, no matter how ingenious the plot was, it would only be a joke. The strategy of creating a diversion was a complete failure. The messenger delivered a message. The enemy's boat has docked. We've checked. There are only straw dolls and a small soldier manning the helm on the boat. Jiang Pengji clicked her tongue and said to Li Yun, "It's our turn next. Han Mei, let's go." Wu Liba used an unmanned boat to attract attention. He would definitely sneak ashore and launch a sneak attack. No matter when he launched a sneak attack, his target would be the main camp. Instead of playing hide and seek with them, it would be better to stay where they were and defend the main camp's defense line. They would wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves. Li Yun clenched the silver spear in his hand tightly. He looked cold on the surface, but his heart was surging with excitement. He was not a bloodthirsty and warlike person, but he was unwilling to remain calm. Now that the world was in chaos, only by following his lord to quell the chaos could his family and lover live in peace. His lord had muttered something before, and Li Yun felt that it was quite reasonable. The so-called peaceful life was just someone carrying the burden for you. As the head of the family, Li Yun was a son, a husband, and a father. He was willing to bear the burden for them. Night enveloped the land, and it was pitch black. The night wind of the northern borderline was as cold as a knife. When it hit his face, it hurt. It was as if it could penetrate deep into his bones. As they had just arrived, Jiang Pengji's main camp had not been completed. The outer defense was complete, but the wooden fences were like paper in the eyes of the northern borderline cavalry. They could not withstand a single blow. Most of the tents in the camp had not been set up yet. He could faintly see some figures moving around the perimeter. They should be the patrolling soldiers. Wu Liba had calculated the time and disembarked in batches. He was prepared to devour Jiang Pengji's 30,000 elites in one go. As long as they successfully defeated the Lu family's vanguard troops and dampened their morale, they wouldn't have to worry too much about the main army. Wu Liba had fought in all sorts of battles in his life, but this was his first time fighting against the Central Plains on his home turf. Whistling arrows soared into the sky. Upon hearing the order, the soldiers of the northern borderline launched a swift and violent attack on Jiang Pengji's camp. Wave after wave of fire arrows landed on the camp, instantly setting it ablaze. Wu Li drew his long saber and roared with all his might. Charge! Just as he had expected, the simple defensive measures of the camp could not withstand the ferocious cavalry of the northern borderline. After a wave of attacks, the fence outside had already collapsed and was almost destroyed. Wu Liba had brought 10,000 men with him for this sneak attack, of which 50% were cavalry. According to his initial estimation, the soldiers of Jiang Pengji's camp should be in a state of deep sleep. Even if they reacted, they would be thrown into confusion by the sudden sneak attack. They wouldn't be able to organize an effective defense, let alone attack. Once Jiang Pengji's army lost order due to panic, it would be the best opportunity for the northern borderline to expand and reap the spoils of war. Wu Liba directly rushed toward the reserves of the camp. No matter how elite they were, once they ran out of food, even if they didn't sacrifice many people, they wouldn't be able to raise their morale. However, what happened next was beyond Wu Liba's expectations. Not only did the soldiers who rushed out of the camp not panic, but they all wore heavy armor and held heavy shields and long sabers in their hands. The heavy shields formed a fish-scale formation, forcefully blocking the cavalry's momentum of charging. They cooperated seamlessly with each other. Their hands rose and their sabers fell. The warhorse beneath the warriors neighed and fresh blood gushed out like a pillar of blood. The cavalry of the northern borderline tried to attack with their spears, but the tip of the spear could not penetrate the fish-scale shield. Not only did it not leave any marks, but they were also pierced through by the spear or chopped into two with a long saber because they couldn't stop in time. There were many soldiers, but due to the limitations of their armor and weapons, their speed of movement was not fast. To make up for the disadvantage of mobility, there were often soldiers from other units who cooperated in battle. The cavalry of the northern borderline fell into a chaotic battle. Because of the heavy shields, it was difficult for the warhorses to display their advantage in speed. On the other side, Wu Liba also realized that something was wrong. Their sneak attack failed and they were ambushed by the enemy instead. Wu Liba secretly gritted his teeth. He brandished his saber and killed a few people, then decisively gave the order. Retreat! Since it was a premeditated ambush, it would not be easy for Wu Liba to escape. Not long after, there was a commotion in the rear formation. The enemy must have gone around to the rear to ambush them. Wu Liba's face darkened. The battle cries from both sides never stopped. Although the northern borderline came to ambush them, they did not have the advantage of a sneak attack. There were only about 10,000 of them. Although Zhang Pengji was ambushed, she had already made preparations for battle. 30,000 elites were sharpening their sabers. As soon as the two armies met, the northern borderline was beaten senseless. In a chaotic battle, not only did it require a large number of people, but it also required individual combat and tacit understanding. The soldiers of the northern borderline were physically strong. They were not afraid in a one-on-one fight, but which of the soldiers under Zhang Pengji were not well trained? Not to mention the male soldiers, even the girls in the female battalion all had six-pack abs. As for tacit understanding, there was no need to elaborate. Although Zhang Nongqin was the captain of the female battalion, she could also lead the soldiers of the male battalion. She nimbly controlled the warhorses and led the troops to the rear of the northern borderline for a sneak attack. In the end, she even shouted loudly, "The northern borderline has been defeated. The northern borderline has been defeated. The old man, Wu Liba, is dead." The night was dark. The surroundings were already in a chaotic battle. The northern borderline was in a difficult situation, and it was difficult for them to deal with the situation. They could not even care about themselves. How could they receive accurate information? When Jiang Nongqin led the troops to ambush them from the rear and disrupted their formation, she shouted this. Many soldiers of the northern borderline believed her. Their morale plummeted. They turned around and ran. They dared to turn around and run during the chaotic battle. This was not fleeing for their lives. This was sending warmth and heads to the enemy. The turmoil and chaos at the rear spread rapidly to the front like a rolling snowball. When Wu Liba heard the hurried shouts of the soldiers, he was so angry that he almost vomited blood. Damn it, I'm right in front of you. Seeing that things were not going well, Wu Liba could only withdraw his troops decisively. As he retreated, he stopped the rumors from affecting the morale of the troops and used it to stabilize their position. However, in the chaos of war, the effect of Wu Liba's efforts was limited. The army of more than 10,000 abandoned thousands of corpses and retreated while fighting. They were forced to flee to the banks of the Yi River. Chapter 976. The northern borderline camp was brightly lit. No one was in the mood to sleep. The acting king was anxiously waiting for news of victory. He was in no mood to care about his beautiful wives and concubines, ignoring their resentful gazes. Still no news. He paced back and forth in the main tent, as if he wanted to rub two holes in the animal skin rug on the floor. Reporting to the acting king, "There is no news at the moment," the guard reported respectfully. The acting king was getting more and more anxious. Wu Liba's battle was of great importance. If he could get off to a good start, the pressure on the northern borderline would be greatly reduced. What time is it now? After a while, the acting king sat back on his throne gloomily. His heart was beating steadily, but he felt a little flustered. The guard said, "Reporting to the acting king, it is now the hour of the 11th hour. Hour of the 11th hour? It's actually so late." The acting king muttered to himself, It will be dawn in an hour. Why is Wu Liba not back yet? The guard looked calm on the surface, but in his heart, he despised the acting king. Fighting a war was not like anything else. It was not possible to say when one would return. There must be a limit to one's willfulness. If Wu Liba, who was bathed in blood, knew what the acting king was thinking, he would definitely be furious. The remnants of the northern borderline were forced to the riverbank. There was nowhere to retreat and they were in a hopeless situation. Wu Liba felt a sense of sorrow, but he did not show any negative emotions. He continued to encourage the soldiers to fight to the death with the enemy. If it was any other time, a fight to the death might have been able to explode with shocking combat power. However, the morale of the northern borderline had been continuously thwarted and had fallen to rock bottom. The soldiers pushed and shoved each other, fighting to be the first to climb onto the boats to cross the river. There was no order to them at all. The only thought in their minds was to escape. How could they listen to Wu Liba's commands? They did not listen to commands and did not follow orders. The people squeezed and squeezed together. Not only did not many escape successfully, but they also caused more casualties. Many people climbed onto the boats, but were careless and pulled down by their comrades behind them, falling into the bone-chilling water. Seeing that it was difficult to board the boats, they relied on their good swimming skills and jumped into the water, attempting to swim back to the other side. Wu Liba could only watch helplessly as they collapsed and escaped into the water like dumplings. He could only sigh deeply. His eyes filled with sorrow. "General, don't hesitate. You should board the ship and retreat first." The deputy general had prepared a boat for him. As long as he could cross the river and reach the other side, Wu Liba would be safe. The battle had just begun. If Wu Liba died here or was captured, the morale of the northern borderline would suffer a devastating blow. Wu Liba knew the seriousness of the matter. He endured the pain from his wound and boarded the ship under the protection of a few deputies. "Lieutenant Jiang, the archers are ready." Jiang Nongqin looked coldly at the enemies on the riverbank and said, "Fire!" On the battlefield, there was no such thing as stopping at the right time, and there was no such thing as gentlemanly demeanor. It had always been to seize the opportunity to kill the enemy. Jiang Nongqin commanded thousands of archers to line up in 3 rows. They took turns to shoot at the riverbank and the water surface. The river was bone-chilling, and most of the soldiers of the northern borderline were injured. Even if they swam to the other side, they were basically half dead. Jiang Nongqin even sent several waves of arrows to them. In an instant, corpses floated to the surface of the river and blood dyed the river red. Report. In the northern borderline camp, the acting king finally received the battle report that he had been waiting for. "Tell me quickly, did General Wu Liba capture the bandit leader of the Liu family alive?" The acting king stared at the messenger's mouth with a burning gaze, hoping to hear the good news that he wanted the most from his mouth. The messenger said with an expression that looked like he was about to cry, "General has lost. Our army has achieved a great victory." "Our army has achieved a great victory. What?" The smile on the acting king's face froze halfway. He could hardly believe what he had heard. What did he mean by "General has lost"? Who lost? Which general? The acting king had spent the entire night imagining how Zhang Pengji would suffer a crushing defeat, how Wu Liba would achieve a great victory, and how he would reward her after the victory to satisfy Wu Liba and not shake his rule. He had never expected the messenger to tell him that Wu Liba had lost. How could Wu Liba have lost? He has been fighting for so many years, yet he lost to a woman, Lu Shi? The acting king roared angrily. He raised his hand and smashed everything that could be smashed. Although he did not like Wu Liba and relied more on Haluncha, Wu Liba was the backbone of the northern borderline. How could he lose? Where is he? Where is Wu Liba? After the acting king Yitong vented his anger by roaring, he finally calmed down and shouted at the messenger. The messenger said, "General Wu Liba has been rescued. He is now being treated by a doctor." The acting king roared angrily, "Get that old man to come see me. He lost to a woman, yet he still has the face to treat his injuries?" When the words left his mouth, the guards guarding the main tent and the messenger felt a chill in their hearts. They felt a chill that they had never felt before. No matter what, Wu Liba was the loyal subject of the king of the northern borderline. He had helped the king to conquer the tribes. Even if Wu Liba had not made any contributions to the northern borderline, he had worked hard. The ninth prince was only the acting king. How could he humiliate the old subjects of two dynasties? As time passed, the murderous cries from the shore of the river gradually faded away. As far as the eye could see, there were countless corpses floating on the surface of the water. Fresh blood dyed the surface of the water scarlet. Jiang Nongqin commanded the soldiers to clean up the battlefield. She pulled out those who were still breathing from the pile of corpses and sent them to the wounded barracks. Jiang Pengji raised her hand to wipe away the blood that flowed into the corner of her mouth. She slowly calmed her surging killing intent and breathing. With a clang, she threw the broadsword in her hand to the side. Sun Wen, who had stepped forward, saw it. The blade was covered in blood. Pieces of flesh and internal organs hung on the back of the broadsword. Some of them had dried up and turned black, but other parts were still very fresh. Not only that, but the broadsword was missing a few notches. Many parts of the blade were curled up. It was extremely worn out. It would probably be difficult to use it again. Although he did not see how his lord killed the enemy with his own eyes, judging from the condition of the broadsword, the battle must have been extremely intense. Did I scare you? Jiang Pengji loosened the ropes of her armor. She took out 2 handkerchiefs and wiped her face. Thick blood and pieces of internal organs were all over her face. If it was not for Jiang Pengji's armor, Sun Wen would not have believed that the person sitting on the ground with a golden broadsword was actually a woman. This woman was his lord. Not only was his lord very magical, but the women's battalion that he saw just now was also very magical. She could carry a sword and mount a horse to fight. She could clean up the battlefield and be a doctor. Perhaps this was the saying, like the lord like the soldiers. My lord, your words make you seem weak and frail. Sun Wen laughed bitterly. No matter what, he was of the same generation as her grandfather. He was much older than Lu Shi, but now he received such a consolation that sounded like she was coaxing a child. I'm not saying that you're weak and frail. Scholars are always more delicate. They're not as crude as warriors. As they spoke, Li Yun arrived. Is your hand injured? Jiang Pengji could tell that Li Yun's left arm was injured at a glance. It was probably not shallow. Chapter 977. Even if it doesn't affect you, you have to go to the camp to have a look. If the wound is big, get them to stitch it up. Otherwise, when will the wound heal? After that, Jiang Pengji continued, coincidentally, you asked someone to take my knife to be sharpened. The blade is curled to an unsightly state. Li Yun glanced at the knife his lord had thrown on the ground. The knife was as heavy as a stone. Apart from his lord, no one else could use it so smoothly. However, every time his lord returned from the battlefield, she would take the knife to the bladesmith to sharpen it and fix the edge of the curled blade. It wasn't that the quality of the knife wasn't good. It was clearly because his lord was too eager to kill. No matter how good the knife was, it was a disposable item in her hands. The army hasn't arrived yet. The thread in the camp isn't enough. Li Yun relied on his good health to recover quickly. He didn't want to compete with the wounded for scarce medical resources. The thread we brought isn't enough? Jiang Pengji was surprised. Li Yun laughed. It's not just our soldiers who are injured. There are also the captives in the north borderline. The consumption is greater than expected. Jiang Pengji said, if there isn't enough thread, pull out a few more strands of hair. The wound isn't very deep or long. Hair can make do. Although hair was brittle, when 2 or 3 strands were curled together, their tenacity was not low. It would be no problem in an emergency. A few years ago, Jiang Pengji organized a more comprehensive knowledge of emergency care with the help of the audience in the streaming room. Apart from that, she also consulted the doctor in charge of Wanzhou's medical center about the possibility of suturing wounds. Her exact words at that time were, the human body is like clothes. Torn clothes can be sutured with thread. If the wound is too big, why can't it be sutured with thread? The doctor was speechless. How could people and clothes be the same? However, Jiang Pengji was the lord. Their salaries were all paid by her. The medical center they worked in was also funded by her. At first, they didn't dare to use it on humans. The doctors could only experiment on rabbits or other animals. They even asked the embroidery maids for advice on various embroidery techniques. Facts proved that after the wound was sutured, the recovery speed was much faster than without. The chances of pus festering and death were also greatly reduced. The doctors searched for all kinds of threads suitable for suturing wounds. They even taught this surgical technique to the soldiers in the women's camp. Most of the soldiers who died in the war didn't die on the battlefield. They died because their wounds were not treated in time or because their wounds became inflamed and pus. With better medical care and suturing techniques, most of the injured soldiers could survive. Thanks to this, the women's camp became more and more popular. If it weren't for the rule that women could only get married at the age of 25, many male soldiers would have wanted to get married. Keep the goodies within the family. Most of the female soldiers who retired early because of their injuries chose to stay in the army as logisticians. Their marriage partners were either retired male soldiers, or they had their own household registers. They chose a decent captive to start a family, and became the head of the family themselves. Regardless of which one it was, he was currently living his life as he wished and was enviable. Hair 2. Li Yun was surprised. All right, then I will make a trip to the casualty barracks later. While they were talking, the sky was already completely bright, and the red clouds on the horizon were like a halo of paint. The live stream viewers stayed up all night. Most of them were so sleepy that they couldn't open their eyes, but when they saw the floating corpses on the surface of the water, they were so shocked that they lost all desire to sleep. Send someone to fish up these corpses and bury them. Otherwise, the corpses will enter the mouths of the fish and prawns and contaminate the river. It will be inconvenient for us to use water. Zhang Pengji ordered someone to retrieve the corpse. They only cleaned up the corpses on their side of the river. They didn't have to bother with the corpses that floated to the other side, lest they got shot full of holes. After the great victory at the Yi River, the morale on Zhang Pengji's side was unprecedentedly high. Because Dongqing had suffered too many losses at the hands of the North Borderline, before the war started, everyone was still anxious and fearful. Dongqing had lost at their home ground. Could they win if they ran over to their territory? The facts proved that not only did they win, but they also won by a landslide. Compared to the jubilation on this side, the North Borderline camp on the west bank of the Yi River was filled with a heavy and gloomy atmosphere. Wu Liba was a veteran general, but he was fiercely reprimanded by the acting king in public. He had lost all his face. Even Wu Liba's political enemy, Haruncha, could not help but feel a little sad when he saw his nemesis in such a situation. The acting king was brainless, but Haruncha couldn't watch him continue to court death. Wu Liba had lost, but victory and defeat were common in war. He couldn't beat Wu Liba to the bottom of the valley just because of one loss, could he? There were many people in the North Borderline who were good at war, but most of them were reckless warriors. There weren't many commanders with brains. If Wu Liba was crippled, the North Borderline would be finished. In the past, Haruncha also thought that no matter how good one's brain was, it couldn't be as hard as one's fist. Ever since he witnessed Sun Wen single-handedly toying with the North Borderline's imperial court, he had changed his usual insistence. Nothing must happen to Wu Liba. Thinking of this, Haruncha stepped out to speak up for Wu Liba, which caused everyone to look at him suspiciously. Weren't Haruncha and Wu Liba political enemies? When did the two of them bury the hatchet? The acting king was holding back his anger, but Haruncha was his confidant, so he had to show him some respect. He might as well let Wu Liba recuperate and redeem himself after he recovered. When everyone had left, the acting king specially asked Haruncha to stay. Is there no one in the vast North Borderline who can replace Wu Liba? This old man. He's really getting old. The acting king asked Haruncha. The more he was in this situation, the more he missed Sun Wen, who had met with misfortune. If Zidao was here, how could Wu Liba be so arrogant? Haruncha stood silently at the side. He didn't want to offend the other party. When the acting king had vented enough, Haruncha said, Acting king, in my opinion, Lu Shi won unfairly this time. What do you mean? If the two armies were to face each other, our army would definitely return victorious. In my humble opinion, the plan to create a diversion was a very good one. However, Lu Shi has many strategists under his command. Some of them must have seen through General Wu Liba's plan and have taken precautions against it, setting up strict defenses. In other words, it wasn't that Wu Liba lost to Lu Shi, nor was it that the North Borderline soldiers lost to the weaklings of the Han people. They lost because of their strategy. With that said, the acting king felt much better. Then what should we do? He asked. Do we allow one side to cross the river and fight? Even if they were willing, Lu Shi's side wouldn't agree. They were enemies, not comrades. Why would they trust him? Harunsha said, "That's not what I meant. It's just that morale is low and we urgently need to reinvigorate it." Without morale, how could they fight a war? Obviously, the acting king's ability to grasp the main point was a little lacking. The acting king said, "If Zaidao was still here, I wouldn't have to do this." Harunsha was speechless. F***CK. F***CK. That's F***king enough. Before the acting king could think of a solution, the two of them heard the sound of a bugle horn. Where's the bugle horn? The high-pitched sound of the bugle horn carried a heavy murderous aura. If one listened carefully, there seemed to be the rumbling of drums, as dense as a rainstorm. Chapter 978. At this time, has Lu Shi gone mad? Realizing the source of the war drums, the acting king stood up from his throne. His expression was fierce and ferocious, like an enraged trapped beast. Acting king, this is a good opportunity. Harunsha was also stunned. He did not expect Jiang Pengji to be so bold. After a great victory, she did not rest and build up her strength. Instead, she took the initiative to attack. However, he was calmer than the acting king and quickly thought of the key point. If he could defeat Jiang Pengji head-on and deal a heavy blow to her, it would definitely restore their fallen morale. Thinking of Harunsha's words, the acting king clenched his teeth and tightened his cheeks. "I have 500,000 strong troops. If she wants to fight, I will fight. This Lu Shi will not return." Seeing the acting king's ferocious and bloodthirsty smile, Harunsha secretly sighed in his heart. Hopefully, everything will go smoothly. Harunsha was a little regretful. Why did he have to compete with Wu Liba? He could successfully suppress Wu Liba's limelight mostly because of Sun Wen's meticulous planning. Without Sun Wen's help, Harunsha could only rely on himself to stabilize his current position as a powerful official. It could be said that it was difficult for him to move forward. Banners fluttered, drums beat like thunder, and bugles that resounded through the sky floated to the other side of the river. The acting king rode in a luxurious carriage and personally held the fort for the soldiers of the northern borderline. Wu Liba had been reprimanded and locked in a small dark room not long ago. He temporarily lost his military power. The person who took over his position was Wu Liba's deputy. On the east bank of the Yi River, Jiang Pengji's army was solemn and orderly. The troops were in high spirits. Their eyes glowed with golden light. Each one of them was like a straight and high-spirited spear, their spirits soaring to the sky. Who would have thought that this high-spirited army had been fighting fiercely for a night? Disregarding their combat power, just by looking at their spirit and orderly formation, one would know that this army was a rare elite force in the world. The war drums rumbled and shook the surface of the Yi River. The air lingered with a murderous aura that did not dissipate. The acting king sat in the carriage, breathing rapidly as he looked at the densely packed figures on the other side of the river. His hands involuntarily clenched the armrests. He had previously mocked the idiom of the Han people. The phrase, "every bush and tree is an enemy," was too ridiculous. How could people be confused with plants? Now that he had experienced it himself, he could not tell whether the silhouettes on the other side of the river were humans or plants. A mere 30,000 vanguard battalion, how could they have such might? On the east bank of the Yi River, Jiang Pengji wore a clean set of armor. Her face was clean, and her eyes were clear. However, the smell of blood lingering around her had yet to dissipate. She said to the soldier who was beating the war drum, "Go down and give it to me." The soldier did not dare to disobey and respectfully handed over a pair of drumsticks. Jiang Pengji took the pair of drumsticks and stood at the position where the drumming soldier was. She weighed the drumsticks and listened to the sound of other drums. She raised her arms and stepped on the rhythm of the drums. Dong, a resounding, thunderous drumbeat rang out. It had the same rhythm as the other drums, but it was louder and more spirited. Dong dong, the drumbeat changed from low and slow to high-pitched and rapid, like a shower of rain, making people's adrenaline surge. Jiang Pengji personally went into battle to beat the drums for the soldiers. Their already high morale was suddenly boosted by a large margin. Listening to the rumbling drums, the audience in the streaming room was in high spirits. They trembled all over, as if an electric current had entered their bodies and made them feel limp and numb. Needless to say, the soldiers at the scene were all excited as if they had been injected with chicken blood. Cross the river.
More than 1,000 soldiers boarded wooden rafts and boats and rushed to the other side of the river.
Not only were the soldiers of the northern borderline dumbfounded, but the audience in the streaming room was also dumbfounded. Potashawumi, streamer, don't mess around. You'll be at a disadvantage if you cross the river forcefully like this. Once you enter the enemy's shooting range, you'll be a moving target. Even if the morale is high, you can't be hot-headed and directly cross the river with human heads. That's courting death. On the other side, the soldiers of the northern borderline were already in formation on the riverbank. They steadily pulled their bowstrings. As soon as the soldiers crossed the river, they would shoot arrows randomly. Tudu Feicho. There's no hurry. Even if the streamer is a White Lotus, her subordinates, Sun Wen and Feng Zhan, are also black-hearted. Lao Siji Lianming. Haha, this scene suddenly reminds me of Zhuge Liang capturing Meng Hui 7 times to cross the Lu River. As soon as the bullet screen was released, the soldiers who were the first to cross the river had already passed the center of the Lu River. The army of the northern borderline on the west bank of the Lu River couldn't wait to shoot arrows randomly. Unsurprisingly, all the arrows fell into the water. More than 1,000 soldiers' expressions didn't change. They continued to cross the river, getting closer and closer to the shooting range. Closer and closer. The second wave of arrows from the northern borderline shot randomly. Unexpectedly, the enemy troops who were supposed to be in the shooting range suddenly turned around and rowed their boats, leaving them with a merciless view of their backs. Damn! Jiang Pengji wore a smile on her face. The war drums in her hands were beating even louder and more resounding. Feng Zhan arranged for the second wave of soldiers to board the wooden rafts and boats. His eyes shone with mischief. Most of the boats that crossed the river were seized from the northern borderline. A small number of them were cut down and made in a hurry. What is Lu Shi playing at? The acting king was watching the show with great interest. He was looking forward to thousands of arrows shooting at the enemy troops crossing the river, turning them into a hornet's nest. He didn't expect that after a round of teasing, he would just leave. The acting king was so angry that his eyes widened. The first and second wave of soldiers met up on the river. There were about 3,000 of them in total. They rowed slowly towards the west bank. Just as they were about to enter the shooting range, another wave of arrows came from the opposite bank. The soldiers continued to leave, turning around and retreating. Damn it, teasing once wasn't enough, but they were teasing a second time? The acting king was furious. He slammed the handrail of the carriage and cursed. How could he describe this feeling? It was like a man and a woman going to a hotel to get a room, preparing to applaud for their love. After much difficulty, they finally felt something, but one of them had to lift his pants and leave. Once was fine, but there was a second, a third, and a fourth time. The northern borderline was the pitiful one who was being teased. Their already low morale became even more dispirited. The acting king was furious. He simply ordered the soldiers to board the boats. If the mountain doesn't belong to me, then I'll belong to the mountain. I'll beat these bastards to death. But before this order could be given, it was stopped by Haluncha. The acting king can't. Why not? The acting king was so angry that he was about to explode on the spot. Haluncha said, I've observed them carefully. They can still maintain a tight formation on the water. They are clearly well-trained sailors. Once they enter the water, our army will only be at a more severe disadvantage. I ask the acting king to think twice. Don't act rashly. Although the northern borderline soldiers could swim, they were cavalry that galloped on land. They weren't sailors, so they were amateurs in water battles. The acting king's face turned green after hearing this. Sun Wen saw the soldiers' performance and was quite surprised. Although the surface of the Ishui River was not wide and it was very different from ordinary rivers and seas, the fact that these soldiers could do this on the water showed that they were comparable to ordinary sailors. Who was the Navy commander who trained them? How could he have the ability to turn something rotten into something magical? Sun Wen asked casually. Jiang Nongqin said, Qi Kuang. Qi Kuang? Chapter 979. Sun Wen couldn't be blamed for not knowing. Qi Kuang only knew how to train the Navy all these years. He was timid, unknown, and had a low presence. That person is not bad. Jiang Nongqin said calmly. Both Shi and Hui Jun liked to judge based on Jiang Pengji's interests. Qi Kuang was not good-looking and was an eyesore. His legs were crippled, but he was obedient and obedient.
All these years, he only knew how to work hard and did not bring any trouble to their lord.
Unlike Feng Zhan, a prodigal son who always wanted to lead their lord astray. Teske, annoying. Jiang Nongqin did not like Feng Zhen, but their lord liked Feng Longzi, so she could only love him. She did not give Feng Zhen face, but she would not embarrass him. Sun Wen paid attention and continued to observe the situation at Yi River. He muttered to himself, "It's fine that Feng Zi is evil, but he also likes to play tricks on people." Compared to Feng Zhan, Sun Wen felt that he was like a pure white lotus flower that had grown out of the mud, fair and clear. He liked to play tricks on people and lead them step by step into a dead end. What about Feng Zhen? Before killing the enemy, he would play with them for a while. When the enemy was about to have a mental breakdown, he would slowly stab the fatal knife. Wu Liba was still recuperating in his tent. When he heard the thunderous drumming outside, he forced his injured body to climb up. "Help me out to take a look." Wu Liba was reprimanded many times, but his authority was still there. The soldiers did not dare to disobey. He quietly approached the front line. After observing for a while, Wu Liba thought of a terrifying possibility. "Quick! Send someone to report to the king. Don't continue to waste arrows. Pay attention to the defense on the left, right, and rear." After saying this, his wound split open. Wu Liba's face turned pale, and his vision dimmed. If not for someone supporting him, he might have fainted on the ground. Wu Liba struggled to break free from the support of the soldiers and said stubbornly, "I'm fine. Quickly send someone to report to the king. If we're late, it might be too late. There are too many treacherous people under Lu Shi's command. They can't be doing this just to humiliate us. It's highly possible that they're secretly splitting up their troops and sneaking ashore from the upper and lower reaches of Yi River. They'll make a detour to attack us." Although they could use this method to deceive their arrows and damage their morale, if they did not attack for a long time, the enemy's morale would also be low. Did he play this game just to fool around? Not entirely. From Wu Liba's point of view, the other party was using this method to attract the attention of the northern borderline barracks so that they would have no time to care about anything else. This was similar to how Wu Liba deceived Jiang Pengji last night with the scarecrow on the empty boat. The difference was that Jiang Pengji did not fall for the trick at all, but the north borderline camp was led by the nose and devoted themselves to it. Wu Liba rubbed his temples, hoping that it was not too late. His words were heard by the acting king, word for word. The acting king shuddered and broke out in a cold sweat. What Wu Liba said made sense. They had almost fallen into his trap. Seeing him in a daze, Haluncha hurriedly called out, "Acting king! Quick! Send someone to defend the flanks and the rear. Do not let the Lu family's traitors take advantage of us."
The acting king hurriedly gave the order. Harentia was about to obey the order when one of his subjects stammered.
"If what General Wu Liba said is true, there won't be many people ambushing us, right?"
The acting king raised his sword-like eyebrows and said gruffly, "Why do you say that?"
The subject said, "There are about 30,000 enemy troops on the other side of the river, but Lu Shi's vanguard battalion only has a little more than 30,000 troops. How would they have extra troops to split up and launch a sneak attack?" His words were like a wake-up call. The acting king's expression stiffened. Was there such a thing? He glanced at Haluncha. Haluncha's expression was also dumbfounded. Lu Shi's 30,000 vanguard battalion troops were right under their noses. How would they have extra troops to launch a sneak attack? The answer was, of course there was. The acting king felt that he had been tricked by Wu Liba. When he thought of his reaction just now, he was extremely embarrassed. Send someone to tell that old man to recuperate in peace. Don't try to scare us here. The soldier had no choice but to repeat the acting king's words to Wu Liba. Wu Liba's injuries were not serious, but he had expended a lot of energy and was exhausted. Hearing the acting king call him an old man, and say that he was trying to scare them, Wu Liba's shoulders slumped as if his energy had been sucked out of him. Wu Liba sat paralyzed on his sickbed. He looked like he had aged a few years. He muttered, "This fool has ruined the northern borderline." As the sage of the northern borderline, his life's goal was to let the northern borderline's cavalry step on the Han's hinterland and erase the humiliation of his ancestors, the Chenggu tribe. Just as his hegemony was about to be accomplished, a horse plague had beaten the complacent northern borderline back to its original state. Since then, all sorts of tricks had flown out. The The king's sons and brothers had a falling out. They killed and framed each other, causing internal strife and unrest in the northern borderline. After that, the ninth prince, who had ascended to the throne, was stupid and cowardly. Was he trying to drag the northern borderline down to hell with him? Overwhelmed with emotion, Wu Liba could not think of the key to his plan for a while. However, at this moment, Jiang Pengji had stirred up trouble. Feng Zhan suggested sending someone to discuss with the enemy on the other side of the river. Jiang Pengji glanced at Feng Zhan. War is not child's play. Take it easy. Although it was a warning, one could tell from her indulgent tone that she was not angry. On the contrary, she agreed. Feng Zhan laughed. You really know the time. It won't delay the military affairs. At the same time, the acting king of the northern borderline suspected that he was deaf. What was the person opposite him saying? Is Lu Shi rushing to die? They had been fooling them for almost 4 hours. Seeing that it was already past lunchtime, the soldiers' stomachs were rumbling with hunger. The acting king was about to sound the gongs to retreat and stop fooling around with Jiang Pengji, but the other side sent someone to make an absurd suggestion. The gist of it was, it's not good for us to confront each other across the river and provoke each other. We haven't even eaten lunch. If we continue to drag this on, no one will be able to back down. Why don't we do it this way? You command your troops to hold back a little so that our troops can get ashore and get into formation. Then we'll have a showdown. How about that? After hearing this, the acting king was completely moved. This was a good thing. We'll beat them at their own game and agree. When half of Lu Shi's troops get ashore, we'll order the cavalry to charge and kill them. Lu Shi's troops will be in a dilemma. When the time comes, the troops will crowd the banks of the Yi River. Those who want to escape won't be able to, and those who want to get ashore won't be able to. They'll definitely lose. As for integrity, this was war. Who cared about integrity and conscience? A little fairy with a conscience would not live long on the battlefield. Haluncha vaguely felt that something was wrong, but no matter how he thought about it, he could not pinpoint what was wrong. Not long ago, he had told the acting king that if the two armies faced off against each other, they could rely on numbers to defeat Lu Shi's 30,000-strong vanguard battalion. If he stopped them from getting ashore now, wouldn't he be slapping himself in the face? Thinking of this, Haluncha remained silent. Chapter 980. Haluncha did not know what was wrong. That was normal. How could Wu Liba, as the wise man of the northern borderline and an experienced general, not know? After 4 hours of teasing and the failure of the sneak attack the night before, the morale of the northern borderline was at rock bottom. If they suddenly ordered the troops to retreat a few miles to make space for Lu Shi's army, could they still maintain their original formation? Once the army's formation was in chaos, they would not be able to organize an effective attack or defense. The enemy's army would land first and launch a strong attack. In this way, even if the enemy only had 30,000 vanguards, they could still win with fewer troops. The acting king planned to sneak attack Jiang Pengji when the enemy was halfway to land. Would Jiang Pengji be schemed against? It was obvious that there was a trap. Wu Liba was dizzy for a while. He slowly recovered and forced himself to send someone to warn the acting king. Although the acting king was disrespectful to him, Wu Liba could not ignore the overall situation of the northern borderline because of the personal grudge between the king and his minister. The troops serving Wu Liba gritted their teeth and could only obey the order. They could see that the acting king might not appreciate Wu Liba's kind reminder. Not only would he not appreciate it, but he would also humiliate him. Before the troops could send the message, the situation on the battlefield changed drastically. It was too late to send the message. Just as Wu Liba had expected, the northern borderline had a large number of people. Other than 90,000 elites, the remaining 80,000 were militia that had been conscripted at the last minute. The elites could still keep calm and maintain their formation, but the militia that had not gone through much training was different. When the order to retreat was given, the militia was the first to fall into chaos and lose control. People squeezed each other and feet stamped on each other. The formation quickly became chaotic. Seeing the situation, the generals of the northern borderline hurriedly came forward to give orders, hoping to control the increasingly chaotic situation. At that moment, the troops that were swaying on the Yi River seized the opportunity to cross the river and attack the chaotic army. Seeing the situation, the acting king of the northern borderline widened his eyes in shock.
he sat in the carriage and shouted, "Quick, meet the enemy!"
The militia realized that the enemy was crossing the River and became more and more panicked. The situation was even more out of control. To make matters worse, there was a frightening battle cry from the rear of the army. The acting king's face was ashen, as if he could not believe what was happening in front of him. Lu Shi's 30,000 troops were right under his nose. Where did the extra troops come from to attack his rear? Zhang Tu sure came at the right time, Li Yun exclaimed in surprise and laughed heartily. Fu Wang arrived with the main force of the army. He quietly sneaked to the rear of the northern borderline and caught the other party off guard. Feng Zhan had sent people to toy with the northern borderline, not only to destroy their morale, but also to attract their attention. Give him a taste of his own medicine. Last night, Wu Liba attempted to create a diversion to attack the main camp. Who would have thought that they would return the favor the next day? It's better to come at the right time than to come early. If we can achieve a great victory, we must reward the whole army generously. As soon as Zhang Pengji said this, the aura of a nouveau riche was unleashed. Feng Zhen said, "My lord, you must keep your word. Zhan is waiting." Although he was not Su Ku, he knew that his lord was a filthy rich tycoon. This was a great opportunity that had been delivered to his doorstep. If he didn't ruthlessly beat up the tycoons, wouldn't he be letting himself down? Zhang Pengji's army, which had landed on the shore, launched a fierce attack on the army of the northern borderline. The elite troops of the northern borderline were not to be trifled with. They quickly organized an effective counterattack. A fierce battle broke out between them and the elite troops of Zhang Pengji's vanguard battalion on the riverbank. However, this bit of advantage was quickly overshadowed by the losses at the rear of the northern borderline. Fu Wang led the main force of the central army to sneak attack the rear of the northern borderline's main camp. It was as if a sharp knife had ruthlessly stabbed in and cut open the flesh. The head and tail of the northern borderline could not take care of each other. It was a mess. The deputy general who took over Wu Liba's position rode forward and tried to stabilize the situation. He did not expect that the impact of the soldiers in the chaos would be stronger than a flood. The war horse under his crotch was washed away, and he fell to the ground. Before he could get up from the ground, countless pairs of feet trampled over him. In the chaos, how many people were trampled into meat paste? Some people did not even have the chance to wail before they were already dead. Seeing that the situation was not good, the acting king retreated early under the protection of his guards. Even the acting king, who had personally led the troops into battle, had fled. How could the other ministers and generals sit still? How could the soldiers below still have the energy to fight? In an instant, the entire army of the northern borderline retreated in defeat. Wu Liba was deeply worried. Just as he was thinking about how to persuade the acting king and salvage the situation, the soldiers rushed into the tent. "General, our army has been routed. Please escape with me." Wu Liba suddenly got up from his bed, his eyes wide open like copper bells. What? What do you mean by our army has been routed? Hearing the battle cries outside, Wu Liba felt as if he had fallen into an ice cellar. Suddenly, a group of enemy troops charged at our rear. There are also enemies forcefully coming ashore on the riverbank. Our army can't take care of the front and tail at the same time. Just like that, Wu Liba felt as if he had been hit by an invisible hammer. His body swayed and he took a step back. His face was ashen. "General, let's escape." "It's too late now." The soldiers hurriedly tried to persuade Wu Liba. The acting king had already fled with the ministers. If they did not escape now, they would be abandoned. They fled very quickly and did not care about Wu Liba, who was recuperating at the back. They did not even send anyone to inform him. It was obvious that they were about to give up. In reality, the acting king was in too much of a hurry to escape and did not think of Wu Liba at the moment. Wu Liba clenched his teeth and squeezed out a word. "Go. As long as there's life, there's hope." He could not be buried here. Moreover, he could not watch the north borderline, which he had spent half his life on, be destroyed. The cavalry of the north borderline fled quickly towards the north. The infantry in cloth armor and the militia who were forcibly recruited to make up the numbers were not so lucky. On the battlefield, one could not expose one's back to the enemy even if one was fleeing for one's life. The army of the north borderline fled in a panic, like a headless fly.
Fu Wang ordered the cavalry and light infantry to chase after the remnants of the army.
They killed and captured, further expanding the results of the battle. The north borderline did not care about their supplies and fled towards the north. They were like birds startled by the mere twang of a bow.
They were scared out of their wits at the slightest sign of trouble.
Ha ha ha, this is great. I haven't had such fun in a long time. It was not until dusk that Fu Wang, who was covered in blood, returned on his precious horse. Li Yun, on the other hand, was riding on his precious Bai. Seeing Zhang Pengji, Fu Wang immediately dismounted. He did not dare to be arrogant.
Your humble servant pays his respects to the Lord.
You've worked hard, Zheng Tu. We'll reward you according to your contributions later. Zhang Pengji personally helped Fu Wang up and said to the crowd, You've defeated the north borderline and captured countless prisoners. Your names will surely go down in history. To celebrate our great victory, we'll slaughter cows and pigs today to reward the 3 armies. According to the average marching speed, the main army would need 2 to 3 days to arrive. In order to cooperate with the sneak attack, Fu Wang rushed over in advance. Not only were the north borderline exhausted, but Zhang Pengji's men and horses were also exhausted. The main army that rushed over held their morale and crushed the enemy. Chapter 981. The northern borderline army was defeated and fled. Fu Wang rested for a while and chased them to the Mainu tribe on the bank of the Yi River. Because he was worried that the enemy would counterattack and ambush, Fu Wang decisively retreated after a while and collected many spoils of war along the way. The northern borderline army panicked and did not know where to run. Men and horses crowded and trampled over each other. Almost all the way to escape was dead and corpses were everywhere. In the chaos, the acting king was accidentally shot in the shoulder by a stray arrow. The pain made his face pale and he cried out in pain. Acting king, we are safe now. The pursuers did not catch up. Haruncha seemed to have aged a lot. The life and death escape was too exciting. He was covered in dirt and looked very embarrassed. They did not catch up? The acting king looked at Haruncha with a pale face. His heart was beating like a drum and his heart was beating like a storm. Hearing Haruncha's words, the pressure of death that followed him like a shadow was slightly reduced. Send someone to investigate. Did they really not catch up? He was afraid of Zhang Pengji's tricks. He was afraid that the moment he let his guard down, the enemy would appear out of nowhere. Haruncha said, Your subject obeys. As soon as he retreated, there was a mournful cry from the sky. When he looked up, he saw a few vigorous eagles fighting in the sky. Ah! Thief Lu has caught up again? The eagle's cry was loud and sharp, piercing through the eardrums. The acting king's nerves were already tense. When he heard the sound, he almost jumped out of the carriage. Haruncha said, reporting to the acting king, A few eagles flew over our heads just now. When the acting king heard this, he recalled his embarrassing performance and suddenly felt embarrassed. He waved his hand tiredly and sent Haruncha away. He really did not want to see Haruncha's face for some time. Who let Haruncha witness his most embarrassing moment? As dusk approached, the fleeing northern borderline soldiers gradually returned to the troops. After sending someone to count the number of people, everyone felt a chill in their hearts. Haruncha even sighed deeply. His eyebrows were full of sorrow and exhaustion. The northern borderline army claimed to have 500,000 soldiers, but in fact, there were only 180,000. 100,000 elites and 80,000 militiamen who were temporarily recruited. Deducting the 10,000 people that Wu Liba lost in the night attack, there were 170,000 left in the camp. After counting, there were less than 60,000 soldiers left. The rest of the soldiers were either dead or captured. The heavens want our Beijiang to perish. Wu Liba had risked his life to escape. When he learned of the outcome, he cried until his eyes were brimming with tears. General, you must not say these words again. If the acting king hears of it, it will not be good for you. The guards who were escorting Wu Liba held him up to prevent him from fainting from the impact. Wu Liba's wounds had ruptured, and his complexion was ashen and lifeless. He swallowed the anger and sorrow in his heart, his fingers trembling as he held the broadsword tightly. You're right, I can't fall yet. A fierce look flashed across Wu Liba's eyes. He asked the soldier, Where are we now? The other party said, The Mainu tribe. Mainu tribe? Wu Liba's lips trembled as he said, "So it's here." There were many large rivers in the northern borderline, but there were only so many places with lush pasture. Often, only the most powerful tribes could occupy the places with the most lush pasture and the cleanest water flow. The Mainu tribe occupied the most extensive pasture on the banks of the Ishui River. It was ranked highly in the northern borderline. The most important thing was that the Mainu tribe was the mother tribe of the third and fifth princes. Wu Liba was the third prince's teacher. Instead of continuing to let the acting king drag the northern borderline to hell, it was better to take the opportunity to launch a coup with his disciple and get rid of the acting king. This audacious thought lingered in his mind, and he couldn't get rid of it no matter what. They fought on an empty stomach and fled for their lives for a day. The northern borderline army also lost a large amount of military supplies. At this moment, they were hungry, tired, and cold along with their horses. In stark contrast to them, Jiang Pengji set up a bonfire. She roasted the fire, ate the meat, and sang and danced. The northern borderline fled in all directions. Jiang Pengji kindly accepted all their logistical supplies. The war horses that were in good condition were captured. Those that were crippled or severely injured were slaughtered and roasted. The entire campsite was red and filled with a lively atmosphere. The soldiers outside rejoiced and danced. A moderate-sized celebration feast was also held in the main tent of the Central Army. Speaking of the celebration feast, everyone was both happy and upset. For a foodie like Yang Si, who only cared about eating and nothing else, this kind of celebration feast couldn't be better. But for normal people, it was a little uncomfortable. Although it was good to have their own entertainment to liven things up and bring everyone closer, it was always like this. Who the hell liked to see a bunch of grown men twisting their waists and shaking their butts? Unexpectedly, their lord had chosen a dancer to liven things up for the first time today. "Dancers, dear. Is what the lord said true?" Feng Zhan was the first to brighten up. His entire face lit up. Don't think that he was too frivolous. It was obvious that he was the only one present who was suitable to ask this question. Li Yun had already jumped into the grave of marriage. His wife was the little sister Shangguan Wan, who was protected by the lord. Would he dare to be interested in a dancer? Qiguan Rang was also a married man. He was introverted on the inside. Even if his eyes really wanted to see a dancer, he would still maintain a gentlemanly appearance. Sun Wen couldn't say much. He was a grandfather. He had to set a good example for his grandson. He wasn't passionate about women. As for Wei Sai, yes, he had unspeakable feelings for the lord. Feng Zhen knew very well that this fellow wouldn't jump out. Fu Wang seemed to have deep feelings for Lady Hui. As a man who had been a vegetarian for many years, it was probably not suitable for him to intervene in such a topic. As for Zhang Xiaowei, she was a woman. No matter how good a dancer's figure was, she didn't feel anything. Among everyone present, only Feng Zhan had the right to speak. Jiang Pengji smiled and said, "A gentleman keeps his word. He keeps his word." The group of people from the northern borderline fled too quickly. Not only did they lose a lot of supplies, but they also lost a lot of burdens. When our army searched the northern borderline's camp, we found dozens of exotic dancers. Of course, apart from the dancers, there were also a few who claimed to be the concubines of the acting king of the northern borderline. They can also sing and dance. It wasn't easy for us to win the war. We should reward them well. I simply ordered them to write songs and songs to let everyone relax. Everyone watched indifferently. Feng Zhen was wrong. Apart from him, his lord was also very interested in the dancers. Extremely beautiful. I heard that the women of the northern borderline are good at singing and dancing. The dancers who have been meticulously trained are even more charming. Feng Zhan was so happy that he almost grinned to the back of his ears. These dancers were originally carefully raised by the acting king. Now, Jiang Pengji and the others had taken advantage of them. A burst of exotic music sounded. More than 10 extremely sexy dancers with revealing clothes stepped in from outside the tent. Each of them was like a nimble fish. They passed through the gaps in the tent as if they had no bones. Their bare feet stepped on the soft animal skin cushions. The facial features of the people from the northern borderline were more defined and deep. They carried the passion and boldness that was rare for Han girls. They were like a raging flame. Chapter 982. Other than Feng Zhan, Jiang Pengji, and the audience in the streaming room, who were engrossed in watching, everyone else seemed disinterested. They lowered their heads and ate. They had lived a simple life for too long and were used to dull banquets. Faced with the delicacies in front of them, they felt bored. Gue kai guo fengxiao. Aya, it's not bad to be able to cross over. If I could be as successful as the host, I would be able to rule the world and sleep with beauties. Just thinking about it made him envious. The ladies were really good-looking, as beautiful as flowers and jade. The faces of the Han women were delicate and reserved, and their facial features were relatively plain. The beauties of the northern borderline were more profound and more in line with the aesthetic standards of the audience. Her face was secondary. The key was her breasts and buttocks. They were protruding in both the front and the back. It felt good just by looking at them. Qing luo you under the moon. #pick nose, you said it yourself. If you are as good as the streamer, what if you don't? Yu Chao Mu Hue. The greatest enjoyment of watching a live broadcast is seeing a group of naturally beautiful young ladies. It cured my face blindness for many years. The audience was talking all at once. The rhythm of the musicians playing their instruments was sometimes passionate and high-pitched, and sometimes it was as if they wanted to refuse or speak. It was as if there was a slender hand gently teasing the softest heartstrings in their hearts, faintly discernible and indistinct. Jiang Pengji smiled and extended her hand to the dancer in the middle. The dancer's eyes sparkled and the corners of her lips curled up slightly. She walked forward with cat-like steps and extended her right hand. Hands as soft as silk, as fine as cream. Jiang Pengji smiled and praised them in front of everyone. The leading dancer smiled brightly, but the others' faces darkened. Qiguan Rang stole a glance at his lord, while Feng Zhan stole a glance at Wei Ci. Since ancient times, it was only men who flirted around and flirted with other women. When had women ever flirted around? However, it was their lord's fault for being different from others. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with her. The dancers performed a few celebratory group dances. Apart from Jiang Pengji and Feng Zhan, who were enjoying the show, the others were expressionless. What do you think? Jiang Pengji didn't get enough of it even after the female dancer left. She asked her subordinates cordially. Feng Zhan rushed to say, the dance is beautiful, but the person is even more beautiful. The others remained silent. Jiang Pengji said, I think so too. The battle at the northern borderline would take at least a year and a half if they were optimistic. The pressure on the soldiers was too great. In my opinion, it would be better to let these dancers perform occasionally. On one hand, it would reward the entire army, and on the other hand, it would relieve the pressure from the festive songs and dances. There were no psychologists in this era. Even if the soldiers had emotional problems, they could only rely on themselves to mediate. Jiang Pengji planned to set up a song and dance troupe and occasionally perform a few performances to liven things up. She wanted to relieve the emotional stress of the soldiers through entertainment. Everyone was speechless when they heard this. They thought that their lord simply liked the color of the dancers, but they didn't expect that her mind was actually thinking about serious matters. In comparison, Feng Zhan, the prodigal son, was at a disadvantage in terms of thinking. Fu Wang frowned and said disapprovingly, My lord, won't this destroy the military discipline? The military camp was a proper place. Why did they let these dancers dance and sing? Isn't it too pedantic to say that? Jiang Pengji said, except for a few veterans, most of the soldiers who followed our army into battle are decent citizens. Not to mention killing people, some of them had never even slaughtered a chicken or duck. Now that I've killed someone, I'm secretly afraid. His sword-like eyebrows were tightly knitted together, leaving a few wrinkles between his brows. Fu Wang still remembered the scene of him killing someone for the first time, but he didn't feel afraid or hesitant. His lord worried too much. If you're afraid of even this, how can you survive? The swords and knives have no eyes on the battlefield. Jiang Pengji smiled but didn't say anything. Anyway, it's settled. Just treat it as an extra benefit that I'm planning for the soldiers. Fu Wang was helpless. After all, she was the lord. As long as it didn't involve a serious issue of principle, almost no one would stop her. Taking 10,000 steps back, she was doing it for the sake of the soldiers. After a simple celebratory feast, everyone went about their business. Although they had won a great victory that day, they still had to sort out the spoils of war, settle and guard the captives, and count the number of casualties. In addition, the soldiers were also unbearably tired. If they weren't immersed in the joy of victory, they might have found a place to lie down and sleep. Everyone left one after another. Zhang Pengji specially asked Wei Ci to stay behind. Before Feng Zhen left, he winked at Wei Ci. Qiguan Rang gave him a pitiful look. The former's eyes said, "Seize the opportunity," while the latter's eyes said, "Take care." Wei Ci was speechless. Zixiao. Zhang Pengji held Wei Ci's hand. It wasn't as soft and warm as a woman's. Instead, it was a little hard. Wei Ci lowered his eyelids and his gaze fell on her hand. He opened his thin lips slightly and asked calmly, "Is the Lord comparing the feel of the two?" At that moment, the live stream room hadn't closed yet. The audience watched the development in horror. They were stunned for a second, then they cried out, "Little Ding Ding who drifts with the waves. Did I miss an important plot? Why does Beauty Ci accept being touched by the streamer without any ill feelings? In the past, not to mention touching hands, she even had to reprimand or avoid flirting." Red Spider Lily. "Don't ask me. I don't know either." Zhang Pengji asked, "Zixiao, are you jealous?" Wei Ci said, "She's just a woman. There's nothing to be jealous of." If he was jealous of even this, he would have drowned in a vat of vinegar in his previous life. It was strange. Her Majesty and men were close friends, but women always harbored ill intentions toward her. "TSK. Look at how calm you look. You've seen through it," Zhang Pengji said. "You're used to big storms and big waves." Her words had a double meaning. Wei Ci was not as panicked as before. He had a hunch that the person in front of him had not only exposed his identity, but she had also speculated a lot about his previous experiences. "As long as you like it," Wei Ci said. Ching 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 Ha. What is going on in Beauty Ci's mind at this moment? As a man who can surf in the sea of vinegar, he is fearless. Zixiao is too cold. "I'm not happy." Zhang Pengji reached out to him. "I'll only be happy if you kiss and hug me." Wei Ci blushed silently. How could she be so blatant? It wasn't that his level wasn't high enough, it was just that the person he met was too high. "My lord, stop fooling around." Wei Ci paused and added, "This is a military camp." "It's fine as long as it's not a military camp?" Wei Ci said. "That won't do either." Was Her Majesty so glib in her previous life? She was clearly very quiet, solemn, and serious. "We won a big victory today. Shouldn't you give me something to encourage me?" Zhang Pengji reached out to Wei Ci. He was silent. He took out something from his sleeve and placed it in her palm. It was a small and delicate private seal. The private seal only had one word: Peng. In another place, Feng Zhen was swaying and planning to go to sleep. Seeing Qiguan Rang turn back to look at the main tent, he put a hand on his shoulder. "What a scandal." Qiguan Rang removed his hand from his face. "Speaking of which, isn't it the 19th anniversary of the Lord's birthday?" Qiguan Rang raised his eyebrows. "Just say what you want to say." "You mean they?" Feng Zhen raised his eyebrows. He had an expression that said all men understood. "That's the Lord." Qiguan Rang's expression darkened. His dark eyes carried a bit of sternness. "Feng Longzi, watch your words and actions." Feng Zhen was not afraid of him. He said, "I'm not being disrespectful to the Lord. I'm just worried about one thing. The Lord is a woman. Who will inherit her family business? If there was no heir, for the officials, they would be like rootless duckweed. Their hearts would be unstable." Chapter 983. Feng Zhen suddenly asked, "What if Zixiao oversteps his bounds?" Qiguan Rang glanced at Feng Zhen, his eyes seemingly surging with an unseen undercurrent. If he dares to overstep his bounds, even the Lord won't be able to protect him. The Lord was the Lord, and the subjects were the subjects. If the subjects forgot their duties and used their intimate relationship to become domineering and do things that were not in line with the rules, such as overstepping their bounds and reversing the status of the Lord and subject, even if the Lord was willing to spoil them, the subordinates would not sit idly by. Qiguan Rang lowered his voice. It was a normal tone, but it made people feel an inexplicable chill. "Ah, don't be so serious, Wen Zhang. I was just asking casually." Feng Zhen laughed. Zixiao will know his limits.
Qiguanrang said. I hope so.
He had been watching from the sidelines all these years, and his lord was probably serious. Based on her temperament, the more she was not allowed to do something, the more she liked to be stubborn. It was useless to go against her. On the other hand, if something happened between the Lord and Wei Ci, they would not have to worry about the young master in the future. The northern borderline lost badly in the Battle of E River. The acting king personally led the army but did not achieve the desired effect. Instead, he brought a group of defeated soldiers to the Mainu tribe. Although they were defeated soldiers, after many rounds of rest, there were still 60,000 remaining soldiers. The Mainu tribe could not resist at all. The third prince looked at the acting king patiently. Seeing the other's arrogant expression, he couldn't help but want to mock him. Wasn't the ninth prince quite capable? He defeated his brothers and became the acting king, but in the end, he almost couldn't even keep his pants?
However, even if he said these words for a while, it was very likely to bring a disaster to the Mainu tribe, so he forcibly endured it.
The northern borderline army fled in a hurry and did not take any military supplies with them. Now, 60,000 mouths were waiting for the Mainu tribe to feed them. When the third prince heard the acting king confidently asking him to take out food and wine, he almost exploded in anger.
This ninth prince. The third prince was full of anger and angrily vented it on the decorations in the house.
Your Highness, someone sent an invitation. Who sent it? The third prince casually pulled it over and opened the invitation. His gaze fell on the inscription. Teacher Wu Liba? Why was the other party looking for him? The third prince was suspicious, but he did not dare to be negligent. After a short rest, he secretly met with Wu Liba. When he saw Wu Liba, the third prince could not believe his eyes. This was his teacher? In the memory of the third prince, his teacher, Wu Liba, was a middle-aged man.
Although he was a man from the northern borderline, he had an unspeakable scholarly air. Regardless of the situation, he always looked calm and composed, as if everything was under his control.
In the past, the third prince was attracted by the other party's disposition and willingly acknowledged the other party as his teacher, learning the Han culture of the Central Plains. Now that he looked at it again, he almost couldn't recognize it. Because of his injuries and his repeated outbursts, Wu Liba's complexion was not good. His brows were deeply furrowed, his hair was gray, and his face was wrinkled, revealing his true age. He looked miserable and downtrodden. In any case, the third prince still respectfully called him teacher. His voice also pulled Wu Liba out of his memories.
Get up. Wu Liba glanced at the third prince.
Contrary to him, this disciple of his was doing very well in his mother's tribe. I asked you to come here today because I want to discuss something with you. This is something that I need to ask for your opinion on. The third prince was suspicious, but he said, Teacher, please say it. If I can use my disciple, I will not refuse. Do you want to be the next king? Wu Liba asked bluntly. The third prince's heart suddenly trembled and he almost bit his tongue. What did his own teacher say? Asking him if he wanted to be the next king? Of course he did. Even in his dreams. If he could replace the ninth prince as the next king, who would be qualified to run to the Mainu tribe to show off? However, he was not sure why Wu Liba asked this. Wu Liba originally hated the infighting among the princes. Why did he suddenly ask if he wanted to fight for the position of the next king? The third prince could not figure out Wu Liba's thoughts and intended to test him. How could his thoughts escape Wu Liba's eyes? Wu Liba asked gruffly, I'm only asking if you want to or not. The third prince smiled bitterly. It's not that I don't understand my students, but how can I not know my students' thoughts? Who doesn't want the position of the next king? Wu Liba sighed. If I had known that the ninth prince was like this, I would have helped you ascend to the throne. The third prince asked, Teacher, what happened? Wu Liba looked tired as he recounted the night attack last night and the battle at E River during the day. He said, I was careless and caused the destruction of more than 10,000 elites. This is my fault. But the acting king did not listen to my advice and acted arbitrarily. Sooner or later, the entire northern borderline will be lost. The third prince listened and could not help but tremble in fear. He saw the acting king and the defeated soldiers and guessed that the northern borderline would lose badly, but he did not expect it to be like this. In this way, Lu Shi was not easy to deal with at all. Instead, he was a tiger and a wolf. Teacher, do you mean, to think of a way to depose the acting king? Wu Liba sighed. He said, to prevent the morale of the army from being disrupted, even if we want to depose the acting king, we can't do it openly. We have to find a plausible excuse. I have some connections in the army. If we use them well, we will definitely succeed. The army of the northern borderline had just experienced a great defeat. Their morale had hit rock bottom and they could not climb back up.
If news of the sudden death of the acting king were to spread, it was inevitable that the army would panic.
According to Wu Liba's plan, he wanted the acting king to suffer a stroke and be unable to manage the political affairs. Then, he would push the third prince to take over. The third prince held back his wildly beating heart and said excitedly, "I'll follow your arrangements." After the battle at E River, not only did Jiang Pengji's army not follow up on their victorious pursuit, but they chose a high ground to set up camp. This action made Wu Liba heave a sigh of relief, but at the same time, he had other worries. He always felt that Jiang Pengji was secretly stirring up trouble. The facts proved that Jiang Pengji was really stirring up trouble. Wei Ci could only sigh. His Majesty really had an irreconcilable hatred with the northern borderline. In his previous life, when Her Majesty attacked the northern borderline, she really wanted to kill them. At that time, the northern borderline was prosperous and powerful. The population was close to 2 million. The two sides fought hard for a year and a half, and the northern borderline had less than 500,000 people. With such a ferocious battle record, many people called her the butcher behind her back. When the Zhang dynasty was unified, Her Majesty specially ordered the foreign tribes in the northern borderline who met the requirements to be moved to various places in the Central Plains. Then, the poor people of the Central Plains were moved to the northern borderline to graze and plant trees. Every household was given a certain amount of government subsidies. Compared to the dense population of the Central Plains, the foreign tribes in the northern borderline were completely diluted and assimilated in no time. Wei Ci did not die of old age, but judging from the situation of the Zhang dynasty, there was no need to worry about the foreign tribes becoming strong and threatening the Central Plains for the next 200 years. Chapter 984. Haluncha. Do you think Lu Shi is up to something again? Why hasn't there been any movement for half a month?
The acting king had dark circles under his eyes. His lips were trembling, and his eyes were filled with a shocking madness and anger.
For some reason, the acting king felt flustered during this period. He had nightmares at night, always dreaming of Lu Shi's army attacking the Mainu tribe.
He would wake up at the slightest sign of trouble outside. Then he could not sleep for the whole night.
After a few days, his mental state was extremely poor.
Haluncha pursed his lips and looked at the acting king worriedly. Haluncha thought he was scared out of his wits by the previous battle, so he could only try to appease the acting king and send him beauties for him to enjoy.
It worked well and successfully diverted the acting king's attention. Haluncha's ears were also at peace.
Unbeknownst to him, a disaster was quietly brewing.
Jiang Pengji rested for a while and chose a higher place to set up camp, which scared the acting king who had been paying attention to her. After that day, the acting king's nightmares became more and more serious.
Because of his irritable and uncontrollable mood, he often vented his anger on the concubines who served him, killing people at every turn.
Not only that, but the acting king also used his status to bully the third prince. Every few days, he would summon the third prince to humiliate him and vent his anger.
The acting king is dying.
Wu Liba looked at him coldly. When he has a complete stroke, you will be able to avenge yourself. The third prince's gloomy expression returned to calmness. As Wu Liba said, he had to deal with it calmly. A gentleman's revenge was a dish best served cold. As long as the acting king had a stroke, the northern borderline would be without a leader. For the sake of the army's stability, he would definitely be elected as the new acting king. At that time, he had ways to make the ninth prince die without a burial place. However, teacher, there has been no movement in Lu Shi's camp. I always feel a little uneasy. The third prince tested Wu Liba, hoping to get some information from him. Logically speaking, Lu Shi won a great victory before. He should be taking advantage of the victory to pursue the enemy. Wu Liba sighed and frowned. He said, "This is what I am worried about. I don't know what Lu Shi is up to. Thief Lu is too cunning. She only lets us see what she wants us to see. A while ago, the traitor Lu dispatched tens of thousands of troops to send the captives back to Chongzhou in batches. At first, I thought this was a ploy, but after careful investigation, it was actually true. At first, Wu Liba thought that the other party was using the excuse of transporting the captives to secretly deploy troops to attack other tribes. In the end, he was told that he was thinking too much. The other party did not mean that at all. No matter what, Jiang Pengji did not continue to command her troops to attack. This also gave Wu Liba some breathing space to plan. The acting king now relied on the Mainu tribe for food and clothing. The Mainu tribe was the home of the third prince. It was easy to secretly tamper with the food of the other party. A few days later, the acting king slept with a group of beauties. Just as he was enjoying himself, he felt a heart-wrenching throbbing in his chest. Acting king? The beauty beneath her saw that the acting king did not move for a long time and finally could not help but open her eyes. She saw the man's ashen face, bulging eyes, veins popping out of his forehead and a deathly stillness on his face. If not for the rising and falling of his chest, everyone would have suspected that he was dead. Ah! The high-pitched and sharp cry attracted the attention of the guards outside the tent. A group of people rushed in, and the scene was chaotic again. Haluncha knew that it was unlikely that the ninth prince would gain the upper hand immediately given his age. But Wu Liba and the third prince's men controlled the situation. He guessed something and his expression changed several times. In the end, he chose to rely on the new lord and help Wu Liba push the third prince to the throne of the acting king. As for the former acting king who was afflicted with fever on horseback? After this incident, who would care if he was dead or alive? The third prince had just ascended to the throne and made bold and decisive improvements. With Wu Liba's assistance, he stabilized the camp of the north borderline. He gathered the remaining soldiers, recruited new ones, and restored morale. In order to test the actual situation of Jiang Pengji's camp, he challenged them to a battle every few days, trying to restore the declining morale through a few small-scale victories. This is already the 10th day. Out of the 10 challenges, only 2 came out. The rest of the time, there was a no-fight sign. What does Lu Shi mean by this? The third prince became the new acting king, but he had to clean up the mess left by the previous acting king before he could enjoy the taste of power. The most important problem in front of him was Jiang Pengji, who was watching him covetously from the side. The third prince only had room to breathe after dealing with the external threat. Wu Liba said, "No matter what tricks Lu Shi has up his sleeves, the acting king must not let his guard down." The few confrontations they had told him that Jiang Pengji was far more treacherous and cunning than he had imagined. She was even a little like a hooligan. When dealing with such a person who did not play by the rules, one must not think according to conventional thinking. I will remember. A month passed. The temperature in the north borderline slowly warmed up. Recently, it had been cloudy and rainy. The air was filled with a hot and humid atmosphere. The pasture grew wildly under the nourishment of the rain, covering the earth with a layer of lush green carpet. As far as the eye could see, it was a stretch of green. Because the rain was gradually increasing, the flow of the River had also become turbulent. The river level had risen by a lot. Although the water level had risen, the herdsmen of the tribes along the coast were not worried. They were even looking forward to this year's abundant pasture. The River was a river that rarely had floods in the north borderline. Ice floods were even rarer. The rise of the river level this year was also within expectations. On the other side, Jiang Pengji's camp was secretly rushing to make bamboo rafts and boats. Tens of thousands of captives were sent to Chongzhou, Wanzhou, Hu County, and other places as manpower. These people are not enough, Jiang Pengji murmured. She was holed up in the tent, not knowing what to do. What's not enough? Qiguan Rang entered the main tent and saw that his lord was dressed in black and white. Her back was facing him, and her back was like a lump of iron-eating beast. Jiang Pengji said, 2 or 3 years ago, Zixiao suggested to me to build a reservoir near Shangjing to solve the drinking water and irrigation problems of the people in the nearby counties. If the construction is successful, at least 400,000 people will benefit. However, building the reservoir requires a lot of manpower. The Jingzhou government hasn't finished building it for 2 or 3 years. If the larger reservoir is included, I'm afraid it will take years to build. Qiguan Rang looked at his lord and asked with his eyes, So So, aren't we counting on the north borderline to send some people? If not for this, those captives at least. Jiang Pengji gestured with her hand on her neck. She had to be responsible for the captives' food and drink. They were all food. There was a war now. Keeping these captives would only be a waste of food. If it wasn't for the lack of manpower, she would have wanted to get rid of some of the unqualified captives. Qiguan Rang glanced at his lord. There was some suspicion in his eyes. Wenjing, why are you looking at me like that? He had the demeanor of the leader of the FFF group, burning heterosexuals to death. I'm asking you to take it easy, Qiguan Rang said. Don't let Zixiao step in for this matter. Just push the blame onto Xiao Guang. Chapter 985. Am I that obvious? Jiang Pengji raised her hand to touch her face and looked at Qiguan Rang with slight surprise. My lord's appearance is just short of announcing it to the world. As long as one is not blind, anyone can see the clues. Qiguan Rang sighed helplessly and said, if my lord really wants Zixiao's good, you must distinguish between public and private interests. Don't be too biased toward Zixiao. Take the matter of the reservoir for example. Although it was a good thing to benefit the people, it was unreasonably linked to Wei Si's name. It was inevitable that some narrow-minded people would have doubts. Could it be that the Lord was especially concerned about this matter because Wei Si had suggested it? Once someone had such a thought, no matter how good Wei Si's performance was, there would always be people who would question his ability out of jealousy. This was an inevitable trend in the future. No matter how wise and far-sighted the Lord was, there would be disputes where there were people. The further the Lord went, the more powerful she would be, the more talent she would recruit, and the more complicated the entanglement of interests within the group would be. What was jealousy? Harming a virtuous person was jealousy. Harming a beauty was jealousy. In layman's terms, resentment towards those who had better wealth, talent, reputation, status, or circumstances than oneself was a psychological tendency to eliminate or destroy the superior status of others. It was also a part of human evil. The more negative emotions accumulated, the more they were unable to be vented. They could easily become the driving force for destruction. If not, why would the ancients say, a tree that stands out in the forest will be destroyed by the wind? A pile that rises from the shore will be turbulent. A person who walks higher than others will be criticized by others? Jealousy was rooted in the unsatisfied possessiveness. Who could stand the feeling of having someone good and not having someone good? What if one's heart was unbalanced? Everyone should team up and work together to destroy the thing in his hands, pulling him to the same starting line as himself. Qiguan Rang hoped that the young lord could realize this. She valued and liked Wei Si. In addition to Wei Si's own talent, when put together, it might become a fatal poison. But Wenjing. Jiang Pengji seemed to want to say something, but Qiguan Rang knew what she was thinking before she finished. My lord, do you think you can protect Zixiao perfectly? Qiguan Rang asked solemnly. Without waiting for her to answer, he said, I can't. Jiang Pengji's expression darkened. Qiguan Rang ignored her reaction and told her the truth bluntly. There's a limit to a person's strength. My lord is intelligent and quick-witted. How could you not know what this means? To put it bluntly, if my lord's subordinates were loyal to my lord and gave me advice, but on the other hand, they schemed against Zixiao. My lord, ask yourself, how many of them could you stop? Even if you kill this group of people, those who are jealous of him, those who hate him, will keep popping up. There is no end to killing people. Pledging loyalty to Jiang Pengji and getting rid of Wei Zixiao were not conflicting. If Jiang Pengji, as the lord, could not be impartial and balance the internal conflicts of the forces, the hidden danger would erupt sooner or later. Qiguan Rang was very worried that Wei Si would become the key to breaking the balance. Therefore, Qiguan Rang told Jiang Pengji something very realistic. If my lord really cares about Zixiao, you should think further and be more considerate. Qiguan Rang had initially wanted to remind his lord to pay attention to personal relationships. Now, he felt like an old father who was concerned about his daughter's puppy love. Do you really want to exchange a moment of pleasure for a future of happiness? Nothing has been set in stone yet. Jiang Pengji raised her hand and rubbed her brows. She curled her lips and said, I understand what Wenjing means. In the past, I treated everyone equally, but in the future, I have to distinguish between public and private interests, right?
I know. For Zixiao's sake, I won't let others use me against me for no reason. To sum up Qiguanrang's words, as the Lord, it was not a problem for her to have unspoken rules with her counselor, but she must not be too biased towards him, lest others have imbalanced thoughts and destroy the internal stability of the forces. Rather than admonishing, it was better to say that he was reminding her not to be biased.
Who wouldn't feel disgusted with a lord like Zhou Yu?
If the other party was not Wei Ci but an ordinary man, Qiguanrang could not be bothered to intervene in his lord's private affairs.
He was just a toy boy. If the lord liked him, she could tease him. If she didn't like him, she could just leave him to dry. The problem was that the person was Wei Ci. Did he really think that it was so easy to achieve the best of both worlds? Then, can I make it public in the future? Jiang Pengji seriously considered Qiguanrang's words.
Although she was a little wild and unrestrained, she was someone who had climbed her way from an ordinary soldier to the commander of the army. To say that she did not have the heart to deceive others was even worse than lying through her teeth.
Qiguanrang spoke too bluntly, but it was not without reason. What kind of public? Qiguanrang glanced at his lord. The kind that will be announced to the world? Don't even think about it.
Wei Ci was not alone.
He still had the Wei family, who was related by blood to him. Wei Ci did not have the heart, but the Wei family might not. Jiang Pengji said, "There's no need to announce it to the world.
It's probably the kind where the people around you who you think highly of are aware of it."
Qiguanrang said mercilessly. Listening to this, my lord seems to have some misunderstandings about us.
My lord's behavior is so obvious.
Han Mei, Zheng Tu, and the others are starting to suspect it. Is there a need to specially inform them? The military generals who lacked a brain realized it in hindsight. Did the group of experienced counselors not know this in their hearts? In general, everyone was still relatively optimistic.
They even harbored a kind of indescribable sour mood. The daughter of a cabbage was finally going to harm the cabbages in other people's fenced vegetable fields.
As long as their lord's side did not collapse, they were quite happy with this pair. If not for Jiang Pengji's reliable performance over the years, everyone would not be so optimistic. My lord, think about it carefully.
Qiguanrang let out a long sigh and immediately said, Zixiao is not young anymore.
Huh? Zixiao is older than me by 6 years. You're not young anymore. You should consider the problem of having an heir. If you have a young lord, it's good for the stability of the people.
Jiang Pengji almost laughed when she heard this.
Wenjing, your daughter, Jinghui, is only 7 or 8 years old. Why does she already have the heart of an old father? She really did not dare to provoke the aunties and uncles who were forced into marriage.
Qiguanrang looked at his lord faintly.
Although she was his lord, sometimes he could not help but want to kill her. Weighing his own small body and his lord's combat power, he had no choice but to give up this tempting idea. After talking to Qiguanrang, Jiang Pengji was in a much better mood. Even the gloomy rain outside could not stop her sunny enthusiasm. My lord, did you encounter something good today? Feng Zhen teased. She was smiling like a cat that had stolen a fish.
Jiang Pengji opened her eyes wide and made up a story.
No, I had an interesting dream during my afternoon nap.
A sweet dream? Yes, one day, I will take out the federal allowances and bonuses that I have accumulated over the years and buy a farm that is bigger than the 9 states and 4 seas.
The ancient times were too troublesome. Their territory was not as big as a small farm owner's, but the things they considered were more complicated than a federal marshal's. As a big boss of the Federation, she also wanted to save face. Chapter 986.
Believe me, as the leader of the Federation, my allowance is very high.
Jiang Pengji was a genetic warrior. The risk of her mission was extremely high, and the federal military's allowance was considerable. Of course, if her salary was compared to other army commanders, it would probably be trash. Everyone else had a backer. They were either from an aristocratic family or had a family inheritance. She was the only one who fought with her bare hands. Speaking of which, it was quite inspiring. Her only regret was that she hadn't spent the little money she had saved up after decades of struggling. She had fought for the Federation for more than 30 years, but she hadn't even received a year's pension. Feng Zhen secretly rolled his eyes. How much yellow soup did my lord secretly drink today? If she hadn't drunk too much yellow soup, why would she be talking nonsense? In the face of his lord's intermittent spasms, Feng Longzi was used to it. The camp was calm and peaceful. Every day, the no-war sign was hung high. No matter how the northern borderline challenged them, they refused to go out and secretly made bamboo rafts and wooden boats. Jiang Pengji was calm, but the northern borderline couldn't take it anymore. It was because the Mainu tribe's food reserves were insufficient to provide for the normal expenses of the tens of thousands of troops. Jiang Pengji could waste time, but the northern borderline couldn't. The only way the third prince could think of was to borrow food. However, that fool is too stupid. Which large tribe in the northern borderline hasn't been offended by him? The third prince rubbed his brows. He shamelessly sent letters to the tribes near the River to borrow food, but they rejected him as soon as they heard his intention. They all complained about being poor. The acting king had already exploited them once. If the third prince borrowed food from them again, the tribes and herdsmen would starve to death. The tribe's food reserves are only enough for 10 days. If we don't solve this problem, the third prince was much more reliable than the previous acting king. After all, he was a student taught by Wu Liba. He had ambition and brains. Faced with the predicament of a food shortage, he thought of many ways, but the other tribes refused to buy it. Those who were willing to buy and borrow food openly and secretly demanded an exorbitant price. The third prince was so angry that his face darkened. The third prince fidgeted with the braid on his head and asked Wu Liba, "Teacher, do you have any good ideas?" The northern borderline was too passive now. They couldn't borrow food from other tribes, so they attacked Jiang Pengji. Haha, Wu Liba was a good example. With that, there was no other way out. Wu Liba looked at the flickering candle on the table with a gloomy expression.
It was impossible for him not to be angry when the northern borderline's good cards were played to this extent.
But no matter what, Wu Liba would not easily give up on the northern borderline unless he died. The next day, things took a turn for the better. The third prince stared at the man in front of him, the former crown prince. The enemy had led 30,000 elites and 500,000 dawn of rations to the front lines. On the surface they were here to provide support, but in reality they were here to seize power. Wu Liba looked on coldly and laughed mirthlessly. This old man has really misjudged him. I did not expect the incompetent first prince to have such shrewdness. He used all kinds of methods to defile himself and was even abandoned by the king. I didn't expect that he would secretly amass 30,000 elites and so much food. Was the northern borderline completely finished? Not only did the princes not unite to fight against the enemy, but they also returned to their own fiefs and contacted their mother's forces, as if they were brothers fighting against each other. Wu Liba could not help but feel suspicious. Had Lu Shi already predicted this situation? Did she deliberately avoid the battle just to consume the food of the northern borderline camp and watch the princes of the northern borderline fight amongst themselves? In the face of a great enemy, instead of thinking about defending against external enemies, they wanted to stir up internal strife and pacify the outside world. Were they all out of their minds? Wu Liba still did not know that his prediction was about to become a prophecy. Everyone's minds were really going to be flooded with water. Recently, the rain has been getting heavier. The water level of the River is already level with the riverbank. It's estimated that it will be soon. Feng Zhen took off his wet straw cape. He really did not expect such a terrible rainstorm to happen in the northern borderline. Jiang Pengji said, "Are the boats and bamboo rafts ready?" Enough. 2 days had passed since this conversation. In the middle of the night, the people of the Mainu tribe fell into a deep sleep. Half asleep and half awake, the ground trembled and they heard the roar of waves. Many herdsmen woke up from their dreams and were shocked to find that water had seeped into their tents. Not long after, the water level reached their calves. What had happened? The herdsmen were stunned for a moment and then realized that the River had been released. Everyone, wake up. The water god is angry. Wake up. Everyone, wake up. The water god is angry. Everyone, run for your lives. The sky was dark and the curtain of rain blocked their vision. At this time, the sky was constantly raining. The sound of waves in the distance was getting closer and closer. The trembling under their feet was getting more intense. What is that? Someone shouted in horror in the midst of the noise. The shadow of the distant horizon was approaching them. Wu Liba and the third prince had been discussing military affairs that night. When the rain outside increased and the E River flowed backward, they reacted. Their first reaction was to order the northern borderline soldiers and tribal herdsmen to evacuate from the banks of the E River and move toward the highlands and mountains. The heavens want to destroy the northern borderline. Wu Liba and the others reacted quickly. They were of the privileged class and enjoyed the priority of escaping. In the hazy night, he could barely see the rushing river below. It swept everything away with great momentum. Too many herdsmen and soldiers who could not escape in time were washed away by the roaring water. Facing Jiang Pengji, Wu Liba could still persuade himself that he could win next time if he failed this time.
In the face of a flood that could not be resisted, he could not muster any thoughts of resistance.
How could humans fight against nature? The third prince shook Wu Liba out of his bewilderment.
He said, "Teacher, don't be bewildered.
Although it is the rainy season now, there is nothing unusual about the E River." The experienced elders in the tribe also did not notice any signs of the E River flooding. There must be something fishy behind this. If it was a natural disaster, there would at least be a warning, but this time it came so suddenly. It was more like someone intercepted the water upstream and took advantage of the time when the E River reached the banks to release the water in one go. Looking at the situation, all the tribes along the E River were in trouble. However, was this something that could be done by humans? A bone-chilling coldness spread wildly in his heart. He could not control it. Although the E River was not the largest river in the northern borderline, the land around it was one of the most fertile. Many tribes of various sizes gathered along the banks. If all these tribes were to suffer, the number of deaths would be unimaginable. The flood came suddenly and left abruptly. By the second half of the night, the water had mostly calmed down. Wait, what is that? The third prince, Wu Liba, and the eldest prince, who looked gloomy, gathered together. Both sides counted the remaining troops. Their faces were so gloomy that it could drip water. At that moment, a soldier's low voice caught their attention.
They widened their eyes and could barely see the densely packed black spots floating on the surface of the river. "Those things are coming towards us." Everyone looked carefully and saw that the black spots were indeed moving towards them.
Chapter 987. It's not, it's the enemy. Wu Liba identified for a while and said hoarsely, "Prepare the bows and arrows." Wu Liba was absolutely certain that the flood was not a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster. Thinking of this, he felt cold all over. In just 4 to 6 hours, his hair had all turned gray, and he looked haggard and haggard. The third prince was horrified. The enemy? How could it be? The flood came so suddenly, without any warning. How could the enemy prepare so many wooden rafts and boats in advance? Lu Shi's army? The third prince almost lost his balance. Both his legs were numb.
He said, "How could they predict? If they did not know in advance that there would be a flood, who would prepare simple wooden rafts for an army of nearly 100,000?
This was the north borderline, not the south where rivers intersected. The eldest prince was also full of regret. He originally wanted to bring the army and food to fight for military power, but he ended up losing his life. He had been patiently dormant for many years. He thought he could be the final winner, but who knew that his younger brothers were as ferocious as if they were on drugs? The fourth brother killed 7 brothers in one go, but the 9th brother jumped out and ended his legend of killing 7 people. That was not the most exciting part. What was exciting was that the 9th brother was on horseback. In the end, the third brother, who was originally the loser, took advantage of it. He heard that the third brother had been ravaged by Jiang Pengji and was starving to death due to the lack of food.
He pulled out all his belongings and prepared to take advantage of the situation.
But what happened? He failed to take advantage of the situation. Instead, he was almost wiped out by a sudden flood. Could it be that even the heavens could not bear to see him live comfortably? The eldest prince said, "Haha, General Wu Liba, be careful with your words. Could Lu Shi have single-handedly planned this natural disaster? Even if it was really planned by Jiang Pengji, where did she get the extra manpower?" Thinking of this, the expression on the eldest prince's face froze. Jiang Pengji led the 30,000-strong vanguard battalion to arrive first. She predicted that the north borderline would attack at night before the main army arrived, so she beat them at their own game. She set up an ambush and successfully defeated Wu Liba. After that, Jiang Pengji coaxed the demoralized soldiers of the north borderline to retreat and disrupted their formation. She coordinated with the second wave of the main force to attack the north borderline's main camp from the front and back. The north borderline had no choice but to retreat to Mainu's main camp in panic. From then on, Jiang Pengji's camp only left and never entered. She escorted the captives from the north borderline to Dongqing. In other words, there were only two groups of people in the Lu clan's main camp. The first batch consisted of 30,000 vanguards, and the second batch consisted of about 60,000 main forces. The two batches added up to about 100,000. However, Jiang Pengji had raised the flag of 150,000 people at the beginning. Where did the other 50,000 people go? Could it be that these people had stealthily bypassed everyone's eyes and ears and went to the northernmost part of the northern borderland, upstream of the Yi River to cause trouble? No. War could not be calculated in this way. In order to show off their military strength, they would most likely falsely report a few tens of thousands, just like how the northern borderline exaggerated an army of 180,000 to 500,000. The first prince scratched his ears and cheeks, unable to figure out the truth. Wu Liba did not want to get entangled with the first prince. Right now, they were all in the same boat. If they fought, it would only benefit the enemy. It doesn't matter if it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. The most important thing now is to think of a way to repel the enemy. After saying this, he felt his tongue go dry and sour. As the wise man of the northern borderline, Wu Liba had lived a glorious life. How could he have imagined that he would end up like this? If he did not repel the enemy this time, he would definitely fall into the enemy's hands. Wu Liba was very clear about what would happen to him if he became a captive. The northern borderline army did not retreat too late, but it was not too early either. More than half of their troops were preserved, but they did not bring along much of their weapons. After a few sparse waves of arrows, they had no other way to stop the enemy from approaching. Wu Liba's face darkened. He suddenly pulled out the dagger at his waist. No matter which man from the northern borderline, they all had the habit of carrying a dagger with them at all times because it was convenient to deal with their prey in the wild. It was a battlefield now. An inch longer, an inch stronger, an inch shorter, an inch more dangerous. What use could a dagger and a short knife have? Fortunately, the enemy could not get into a battle formation and advance step by step. Disembark, kill. Fu Wang oversaw the main army, while Li Yun commanded the vanguard. Jiang Pengji, the spoiled lord, was locked up in the little black room. What a joke. It was a chaotic battle on the waterway. It was unusual. If the lord accidentally fell into the water and drowned or was washed away by the flood, they would not be able to save her in time. In this regard, Jiang Pengji could only chuckle to relieve her depression. Her night vision was extremely strong. Even if her vision was dim, she could clearly see the situation at the front line from afar. The army did not forcefully disembark. Instead, they ordered the archers to shoot randomly at the hiding places of the northern borderline army. Some were shot to death by random arrows, some were trampled to death by their terrified comrades, and some drowned when they accidentally fell into the water. Wu Liba spat angrily and ordered his men to collect the arrows shot by the enemy and return them to their original owners. They had lost almost all their weapons and supplies. The number of bows and arrows carried by the soldiers was few and far between, but it was better than nothing. The northern borderline army could not foolishly stand there and be a live target for the enemy. Naturally, they had to make use of all the conditions available to them to struggle to the death. This bunch of people from the northern borderline are really tenacious. Li Yun noticed the enemy's counterattack and immediately thought of the source of their arrows. He used the command of the navy compiled by Qi Kuang to dispatch and tried his best to avoid the enemy's stray arrows. As a general who excelled in land warfare, he had to take on multiple roles. It was a bitter taste to be a half-baked commander of the navy. However, after giving it a try, he felt that commanding the navy was not as difficult as he had imagined. If Qi Kuang was here, he would probably roll his eyes at Li Yun. If the navy was so easy to command, why did he have to train for so many years? Training naval officers to fight in the water was far more exhausting and costly than training ordinary soldiers on land. If Li Yun's opponents were not enemies who lacked bows and arrows, according to his method of command, they would definitely suffer greatly. However, the reality was that the casualties on the northern borderline side were increasing. Li Yun was commanding with ease. After an hour, The soldiers at the lower ground were all dead or injured. Jiang Pengji's army began to forcefully disembark. Wu Liba and the other generals could only lead their troops to resist. However, their front line retreated again and again. It was almost impossible to form an effective obstruction. Seeing that the army was about to be defeated, Wu Liba's eyes flashed with determination. Acting King, the first prince, the two of you retreat quickly. I will cover your retreat. Although Wu Liba's value was much more important than the two princes combined, Wu Liba could not abandon the two of them and escape alone. Teacher, if you want to leave, let's leave together. The third prince's entire body trembled. His arm was pierced by 2 arrows. He was careless and was hit by a stray arrow. Fortunately, his vital organs were not injured. Chapter 988. Wu Liba was the sage of the northern borderline, their backbone. Once their backbone collapsed, what fighting spirit would the northern borderline have? The first prince was straightforward. He said to the third prince, "The flood has receded a lot. If we don't escape now, we won't have another chance in the future." As the prince of the northern borderline, once he became a captive, he would most likely follow in the footsteps of the second prince and be killed as a sacrifice. After months of confrontation, Jiang Pengji had demonstrated her ruthlessness and decisiveness in all aspects. Not to mention the prince of the northern borderline, even if the king of the northern borderline was captured, he would probably die. She was clearly a woman, but the ruthlessness in her bones was stronger than many of the barbaric men of the northern borderline. What nonsense are you spouting? As long as the acting king lives on and reorganizes his troops, the northern borderline still has a chance. If the entire army were to perish here, wouldn't we become the sinners of the northern borderline? Wu Liba was already very tired, but in this desperate situation, he felt that his entire body was filled with strength. Even if he had to die, he wanted to bite off a piece of meat from Thief Lu's body and not let her have her way so easily. When the eldest prince saw that the third prince was still hesitating, he hardened his heart and ordered his men to tie him up and take him away. Before he left, he glanced at Wu Liba with a complicated expression. He had tried his best to rope Wu Liba in, but he did not expect Wu Liba to be stubborn and unmoved. "Goodbye," he squeezed out 2 words, but they knew in their hearts that Wu Liba was doomed. "I will watch over you from the underworld." Wu Liba gritted his teeth and said, "Don't let the northern borderline fall into the hands of the enemy." He wanted the cavalry of the northern borderline to trample on the land of the Central Plains. This was his lifelong wish. He had never thought that the Central Plains would swallow up the northern borderline. Having said that in a hurry, Wu Liba ordered many of the young generals with potential to flee as well. In the end, only 3,000 people were left to guard the rear. Wu Liba had imagined countless endings for himself, but he had never thought that he would be forced into a corner by the cowards of the Central Plains. It was only when dawn broke that rays of light pierced through the clouds and illuminated the earth. By Wu Liba's side, there were only a dozen people left. Together with him and the remaining survivors, they were escorted to Jiang Pengji. Jiang Pengji and Wu Liba had only met thrice. For the first time, Wu Liba was at the peak of his life. He was insufferably arrogant, while Jiang Pengji was a commoner. For the second time, Jiang Pengji was commanding an area and threatening the powerful feudal lords of the northern borderline. Wu Liba, on the other hand, was the envoy who swallowed his pride and asked for peace. This was the third time. Jiang Pengji was still a vassal, but the latter was a prisoner. "Kneel!" The soldier lifted his leg and kicked his thigh, forcing Wu Liba to kneel. The Han people of the Central Plains only kowtowed to heaven, earth, and their parents. Even the emperor could not make them bend their knees, they only needed to bow. However, there was no need to pay attention to this when dealing with captives, especially those from the northern borderline. The captives didn't even have their own lives, yet they still wanted to stand upright? Dream on! Wu Liba cut a sorry figure. His entire face was covered in chunks of flesh and blood. However, his eyes were still filled with terrifying hatred and murderous intent. Jiang Pengji sized him up and easily determined his identity. At the same time, the live stream viewers were also sizing up Wu Liba, trying to guess his identity. For a person who had only appeared 3 times in the live broadcast room, most of the audience did not know him. Tang sect Shengling Kaier. Who is this guy? He was escorted here to the streamer. He should be an important person in the northern borderline? Xiaoshuo Wushuang. He looks a little familiar, but his face is covered in minced flesh and blood. I really want to clean him up with a broom. Fuchi Duo. Streamer, are you planning to offer him amnesty? Offer him amnesty? Impossible. Jiang Pengji did not have that intention, and Wu Liba would not accept such humiliation.
Zidao, why did you send this person to me?
Jiang Pengji glanced at Wu Liba below, her eyes calm and unwavering. She did not pretend to offer amnesty as Wu Liba had expected, nor did she kick him when he was down. Instead, she chose to ignore him. Sunwen smiled and said, "This person has an extraordinary status in the northern borderline. His life and death are in his hands. You should consult the Lord." That's not right. Wu Liba's thoughts returned to him. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets.
He stared at the man in the scholar's robe, who was sitting below the main tent.
Zidao? The word cousin made his heart palpitate. Wu Liba had carefully studied how the ninth prince performed so well in private. The more he studied, the more he felt that there was something wrong with Sun Wan. Unfortunately, he had disappeared and there was no way to settle the score. That person's cousin was also called Zidao. He was also of the same age. Wu Liba's face twitched. He understood in his heart. His eyes were filled with horror. So it's you. Wu Liba gritted his teeth. I was really blind.
I didn't realize that you were the one causing trouble in the dark. If there was no internal strife in the northern borderline and the tribes were not divided, the northern borderline would not have only sent out a pitiful 180,000 troops.
Sunwen replied calmly. You flatter me. Wu Liba could no longer remain calm after receiving Sun Wen's affirmation. He pounced in his direction and opened his mouth to bite. Sun Wen glanced at him. He did not even change his face. His posture was arrogant and disdainful. Jiang Pengji said, "There's no need to ask for instructions on such matters, right? Since we can't offer amnesty anyway, it'll be a waste of time if we meet." If Wu Liba could surrender, Jiang Pengji's body would have to be of pure northern borderline blood. Sun Wen nodded apologetically and said calmly, "Even so, I have my duties as an official. I would never dare to overstep my authority." Trying to figure out his superior's intentions did not mean making decisions on his own. It was even more impossible for Sun Wan to override his lord and make decisions on his own. Wu Liba calmed down a little. He spat in Jiang Pengji's direction. The audience could see the trajectory and appearance of the spit. Wu Liba said, "Demonis, even if you can win for a while, can you defend it forever?" Jiang Pengji said, "I don't know if I can defend it forever, but you can't defend the northern borderline. This is set in stone." Wu Liba spat out a mouthful of blood again. His old face was full of malevolence. "I curse you. Even if you establish a nation, it will eventually fall into the hands of outsiders. Your descendants will die a horrible death." Even if it was a curse and insult, Wu Liba was playing a trick. Jiang Pengji was a woman. Since ancient times, no woman had ascended to the throne and become an emperor, let alone build an empire with her own hands. For such a person, the foundation that she had painstakingly built must be left to her descendants. It was not the place for outsiders to get involved. However, she was a woman. She would eventually marry and become a wife. If her husband was a little ambitious, it was not impossible for the royal family to change their surname. Wei Si's expression changed. He clenched his fists tightly in his sleeves. In his previous life, Wei Si did not restrain his edge from the beginning. He and the emperor secretly formed a bond, and the relationship between them became closer. At that time, the Zhang dynasty had just been established and was in need of manpower. As an all-round expert, Wei Si was put in an important position. He steadily walked towards the center of power. When he was in the limelight, the heavens gave a warning and a meteorite fell. The emperor will not pass on for one generation. Huangfu will take over. Who was Huangfu? Seeing this surname, one would think of the famous prime minister of the previous dynasty. How did that prime minister die? Everyone had an idea in their hearts. He had been dead for hundreds of years. Naturally, it was impossible for him to come back to life. It must have been his reincarnation. After carefully checking the birth dates of all the civil and military officials, Wei Si was found. Chapter 989. Everyone knew that the previous dynasty's Prime Minister Huang Fu threatened the young lord, took control of the court, and attempted to usurp the throne. Now, a meteorite had fallen from the sky, and the words, "The emperor will not be passed on for one generation. Huang Fu will replace him," were left on the meteorite. What did this imply? This was hinting at Prime Minister Huang Fu's unwillingness to give up, and now that he had made a comeback, he wanted to take revenge on the masses. Wei Si's date of birth and 8 characters were exactly the same as the late Prime Minister's. There was not the slightest difference. Who wouldn't suspect such a coincidence? Ancient people were superstitious. They liked to use myths to explain things that they could not understand. They didn't know what the world beyond Earth was like, so they imagined the heavenly palace and the omnipotent immortals. The meteorite was a treasure thrown down from the heavenly palace by the immortals, so the words on it were naturally left behind by the immortals. It was a warning from the heavens, hinting that Wei Si was the reincarnation of the previous dynasty's treacherous prime minister. In the future, this person's power would overturn the court and the commoners. He would plot to usurp the throne and threaten the empire. If it had been another emperor, Wei Si would have died without a doubt. His family and relatives would have to bleed and be buried with him. To the emperor, who dared to covet the dragon throne. Even if it was his own father, mother, wife or child, he would kill anyone who dared to reach out his hand, let alone an official who was in his ascension period. Emperors since ancient times, no matter if they were wise, ordinary, or muddle-headed, they were all filled with a common characteristic: paranoid. No emperor could tolerate others coveting his or her throne and power. At that time, there were snowflakes of memorials pouring into the imperial palace every day, piling up the emperor's desk. The entire court was shaken. The immense pressure made Wei Si breathless. He even thought of committing suicide to preserve his chastity. However, what made Wei Si smile bitterly was that everyone in his residence was a trusted bodyguard sent by His Majesty. His every move was under the watchful eyes of these people. Even when he went to the toilet, there were several people guarding outside. He would call out every once in a while, and if there was no response, he would force his way in. Everyone in the court is against it. Your Majesty, you shouldn't be so stubborn. Your Majesty, please, return me my freedom. Wei Si had never thought of usurping the throne, but everyone unanimously believed that he would do so in the future, so they had to nip the hidden danger in the bud. He couldn't withstand the external pressure. Rather than letting His Majesty order him to commit suicide, it was better to let him decide his own life and death. Wei Si could not decide the time of his birth, but at least he could decide the time of his death. Her small request was mercilessly rejected. His Majesty looked at him coldly and said 2 words after a long while. Wait for it. After waiting for a while, Wei Si avoided several assassination attempts, and Jiang Chao welcomed the first purge. The meteorite that fell from the sky was fake, and the words on it were also fake. This incident was a trap set up by someone with ulterior motives. Conspiring to murder a loyal person might not warrant death, but using false orders from the heavens was an unforgivable crime that would implicate the entire family. His Majesty found out a few families that were involved, confiscated their properties, and demoted them to commoners. Both Wei Si and His Majesty knew very well that the few families that she had confiscated were just abandoned pawns thrown out by others to help prevent her anger. Since the meteorite was fake, the instructions on it were naturally fake as well. Wei Si wanted to wash away the stain on him. He could be spared the death penalty, but he could not escape punishment. His salary was forfeited and he was demoted. After this incident, Wei Si slowly faded away from the center of power. He took the initiative to ask for a position similar to retirement and no longer had any real power. Although it was a trap, the meteorite that fell from the sky still left a deep psychological shadow on him. He had slowly forgotten about it, but Wu Liba's curses evoked memories of the past. Jiang Pengji, who was sitting at the head of the table, curled her lips and said disdainfully, "If the curse was so effective, would you still be a prisoner?" She mocked him rudely. Wu Liba's expression could no longer be seen. Jiang Pengji added insult to injury. "Why would we still need to lead troops to war? Wouldn't it be fine if we just set up a sacrificial altar in front of the 2 armies and compete to see who can speak more viciously?" Everyone in the tent could not help but laugh. Only a few people glanced at Wei Si and secretly heaved a sigh of relief. If the Lord had grown suspicious, Wei Si would be the first to suffer. Looking at it now,
The Lord was open-minded and was not afraid of Wu Liba trying to sow discord. Although you and I are enemies, I respect you as a man, so I won't humiliate you.
Zhang Pengji yawned in boredom. She got up from her seat and casually pulled out a magnificent machete from her waist. She threw it in front of Wu Liba. End your own life. How could dying in the hands of the enemy be more glorious than committing suicide?
At least he could preserve his last shred of dignity.
Wu Liba was confused by Zhang Pengji's reaction.
He stared at her with a complicated look in his eyes.
Really? Of course, Zhang Pengji said, but I can't guarantee that I won't do anything to your corpse. The look in Wu Liba's eyes changed. There was desolation and helplessness in them. The heavens want the north borderline to perish. But Lu Shi, don't be too complacent. Sooner or later, you'll follow in my footsteps. Wu Liba spoke word by word.
He shook his shoulders and broke free from the shackles of the soldiers on his left and right.
He picked up the machete on the ground. My lord,
I'll take my leave first. After he finished speaking, Wu Liba used his right hand, which could still move, to hold the hilt of the machete.
He pulled it out shakily. His eyes were filled with tears.
He did not know where the strength came from, but he stabbed the blade of the machete into the left side of his chest, straight into his beating heart.
His eyes were protruding.
His frozen expression was ferocious and heroic, as if there were thousands of words that he had yet to say.
After a while, he breathed his last breath unwillingly. His sturdy body fell forward, making a dull sound. Drag it out. When the weather clears up, hang it in front of the main camp gate. Zhang Pengji lowered her eyes coldly and looked at the corpse by her feet.
She said without a trace of emotion, when the flood recedes, reorganize the 3 armies, clear the tribes of the north borderline along the Yi River, and pursue the remaining soldiers of the north borderline.
Yes. Everyone retreated. Feng Zhan and the others had solemn expressions on their faces. It was a good thing that Wu Liba was dead, but he had spoken without thinking, which was really infuriating. Looking at Wu Liba's corpse being hung outside the camp, they heaved a sigh of relief. Feng Zhen grumbled. If he's dead, then so be it.
He's causing trouble for others even after he's dead, Qiguanrang said. My lord is not an ordinary person.
She knows very well. As long as she doesn't go overboard, nothing will happen. Although Wu Liba was detestable, he had exposed that layer of window paper in advance. The Lord would also think more about it and be more thorough in her actions. Rather than being caught unprepared in the future, it was better to consider everything now. Feng Zhen said, I hope so. The frightening flood slowly receded, revealing a scene that looked like hell on earth. The corpses were chilling to look at. Zhang Pengji ordered the soldiers to deal with the corpses. The rest of the living were all captured as captives. Along the way, she cleaned up the valuables of the various tribes. The scope of the flood disaster was too wide, and the number of casualties was even more shocking. It directly crippled the tribes of all sizes along the Yi River. Chapter 990. Teacher, teacher, your disciple is unfilial. The 3rd prince cried his heart out. His already weak body could not take it any longer. His pathetic appearance did not seem noble at all. He was not just crying for Wu Liba. He was crying for the fate he was about to face and the predicament he was in. Wu Liba had led thousands of elites to cover the retreat of him and the 1st prince. Although they had successfully escaped, they did not have many weapons on them. They did not even have food or clean water. They had no supplies and were starving. They could only eat grass and tree bark. A few months ago, there were 180,000 elites in the northern borderline camp. Including the 30,000 elites brought by the 1st prince, there were 210,000. 210,000 northern borderline warriors. Now there were less than 20,000 left. They were all defeated soldiers. The nightmare did not end there. The news of Wu Liba's death gave them another heavy blow. The 3rd prince cried. The 1st prince was distraught. He wanted nothing more than to hack his younger brother to death, so that he could have some peace. What's the use of crying now? The most important thing now is to contact all the major tribes in the northern borderline to unite against Lu Buwei. Only then will we be able to face the general. The 1st prince was agitated. They had not completely shaken off their pursuers. They could go see Wu Liba at any time. Teacher treats me like his own son. Am I not allowed to cry for him?
The third prince calmed himself down. But his eyes were still red.
But the first prince was right. Staying alive was the most important thing now. There was hope as long as there was life. He thought of the main culprit and gritted his teeth.
It's all ninth prince's fault. If not for him, teacher would not have died so young. If not for the ninth prince, the useless teammate ruining a good hand, the northern borderline would not have suffered such a huge loss.
The first prince said. Him? Haha, maybe he's already in the belly of the fish. Many living people with intact limbs had been killed by the flood. Ninth prince had gotten wind on horseback. How could he still be alive? The third prince felt better after hearing the first prince's words. Little did they know that the person they were talking about had not only not died, but had luckily survived. Unfortunately, good luck had its limits. The ninth prince was captured by the soldiers who were looking for the living. Everyone saw that he was dressed extravagantly and kept an eye on him. On one hand, he brought him back to the main camp, on the other hand, he investigated his identity. Unexpectedly, he was the former acting king of the northern borderline. Although he was the acting king, he was still the king. The soldier quickly reported the matter to Jiang Pengji. Jiang Pengji didn't want to see him at first, but she wanted to see what he looked like out of curiosity after learning that he could survive a stroke. The ninth prince was carried into the main tent. Because he had stopped taking the medicine, the signs of the ninth prince's stroke were slightly relieved. Previously, he could only move his eyes, but now he could move his neck. The ninth prince had been mentally prepared to beg for mercy, but he never expected to see the white moonlight in his heart in the main tent. Sun One. The ninth prince stared straight at Sun One, his eyes filled with the pain and accusation of being betrayed. His gaze was too intense, and no one could ignore it even if they wanted to. You know him? Jiang Pengji asked Sun One with a smile. He seems to be an old acquaintance of yours from the north borderline.
Sun One said with a smile. This person is the ninth son of the king of the northern borderline.
He's really stupid. It's a good idea to use him to kill someone else. When the ninth prince heard Sun Wen's words, his heart ached uncontrollably. His eyes were bloodshot, as if he wanted to cut Sun Wen into pieces. It was a waste of his trust in Sun Wen, and he was even worried about his disappearance. Unexpectedly, Sun Wen was actually a spy sent by the traitor Lu. Thinking of how he had been fooled by Sun Wen, how he had caused his 9 brothers to kill each other, and how he had caused the northern borderline tribe to fall apart, the ninth prince's expression turned ugly. He looked at Sun Wen with eyes full of thousands of knives. Unfortunately, these knives could not kill. If that's the case, this person is a meritorious minister. Wasn't the ninth prince a meritorious minister who had helped Jiang Pengji deal with the northern borderline?
Sun Wen teased. Considering that this person has made a great contribution, my lord, don't let him off easily.
Jiang Pengji said, rewards and punishments are clear and impartial. Since he has made a meritorious contribution, naturally, we can't neglect him.
Listening to the conversation between the two, the ninth prince's eyes were filled with fear.
He tried to open his mouth to beg for mercy, but in the end, his mouth was full of saliva.
Jiang Pengji said, drag him away.
Let him accompany Wu Liba. No matter how much the ninth prince struggled, he died in the end. His corpse was hung beside Wu Liba, drifting with the wind. While Jiang Pengji was clearing the spoils of war and advancing the battlefront to the center of the northern borderline, the situation in the world underwent many changes. Among them, the most shocking news happened in Zhongzhou. Tens of thousands of refugees broke through the defense line of the palace and rushed into the palace, burning, killing, and looting. Almost no one in the royal family survived. Men were smashed into meat paste by the agitated refugees, women were humiliated to death, and all the women in the palace became captives of the refugees. At the same time, the forces led by the Nie family recruited soldiers and bought horses in the name of purging the rebels, establishing an independent state. Seeing that Zhongzhou had become like this, Beiyuan and Xichang also wanted a share of the spoils. Unfortunately, the two countries had been in conflict in recent years. Many vassal lords were plotting their own schemes and could not spare any time to help. Apart from that, Dongqing and Nanxing did not rest for a moment. Jiang Pengji, Huang Song, and Su Bei formed an alliance. Although it was only to support each other, they also gained many benefits from it. The person in charge of forming an alliance with Su Bei was Yang Si. Yang Si was now in charge of Hu County. He represented his lord in forming an alliance with Su Bei. With Zhang Pengji's tacit consent, Yang Si went to Su Bei as a representative to provide some military support. Originally, the brothers Su Bei and Su Fei were evenly matched, but with Zhang Pengji's intervention, the balance tilted in Su Bei's favor. Su Fei suffered repeated defeats and lost half of Zhe County. He was forced to retreat to Hu County and his power was greatly reduced. Compared to Su Bei's relaxed state, Huang Song was not so lucky. His opponent was the Meng family that controlled the entire Congzhou. The pressure was immense. Huang Song knew the difference between him and the Meng family. It was impossible to fight them head-on. The losses of attacking far outweighed the losses of defending. He only needed to delay the Meng family's pace. He did not need to fight them to the death. With this thought in mind, Huang Song and his strategists chose the safest plan: defense. Defend to the death and not fight. Huang Song forged himself into an iron tortoise. He was armed from head to toe, even to his teeth. No matter how the Meng family clamored, he would not care. At first, the Meng family was patient. However, as time passed, good news about Zhang Pengji in the northern borderline came out one after another. The Meng family could not sit still any longer. They launched several strong attacks, but Huang Song's side could always predict the future. After a few confrontations, the Meng family did not gain much of an advantage. Both sides entered a state of struggle. No one was willing to take a step back. The war in Dongqing was at a stalemate. Yang Tao was doing very well in Nanxing. He invaded Nanqing's territory in the name of punitive expedition against the fake emperor. In just half a year, he had already gained a firm foothold. Chapter 991. And Chui stared at the intelligence report on the table as if he wanted to stare two holes in it. The more he read, the angrier he became. He angrily gritted his teeth and glared at her. He slammed his palm heavily on the table. Bang! There was a loud bang. The table shook slightly from the slam, and the loud sound pierced the eardrums. The sudden sound shocked everyone, and they didn't dare to be distracted. Lu Zhang happened to pass by. He heard the commotion in the room and stepped in. He smiled faintly and asked, "What happened? What made you so angry, my lord?" Seeing that it was Lu Zhang, and Chui calmed down a little, but there was still anger on his face. Panting heavily, he raised his hand and handed the report to Lu Zhang. His face was full of anger. "Look, military counselor. This Yang Tao is too much." Surprise flashed in Lu Zhang's eyes, but he didn't show it on his face. He raised his hand and took the bamboo slip and Chui handed him, unfolded it and took a look. "So it's about this." LV Zhang skimmed through the contents of the bamboo scroll. His tone carried a hint of understanding. He was not surprised by the contents. He looked up at Chui, who was still angry. Amused, LV Zhang asked, "Why are you so angry, my lord?" Chui choked. He didn't expect Lu Zhang to react this way. How could he not be angry? An outsider occupied Nanqing's land. If he wasn't angry, would he line the streets to welcome Yang Tao? Military counselor, you already knew about Yang Tao's plan? Lu Zhang smiled confidently and said, "When the fake emperor escaped from Zhangzhou into Nanqing's territory, I already expected this situation. Most of the feudal lords in Dongqing have grown up. Yang Tao doesn't have a high chance of winning against them, but the risk is high. Yang Tao can't just sit and wait. In comparison, using the fake emperor as an excuse to meddle in Nanqing's territory is less risky." The fake emperor was no match for Yang Tao. After escaping to Nanqing, his days became more and more difficult. If Yang Tao only went for the fake emperor, the weeds at the fake emperor's grave were already as tall as a person. How could he jump around? It was obvious that he was using the fake emperor as an excuse to deliberately encroach on Nanqing's territory. When Chui heard Lu Zhang's explanation, he felt a surge of anger in his heart. Of course, this anger wasn't directed at Lu Zhang. It was directed at Yang Tao. In Chui's usual way of thinking, Nanqing's territory belonged to the people of Nanqing. If an outsider were to encroach on Nanqing's territory, that would be considered an invasion. What was the difference between Yang Tao's actions and the four factions of Nanman? Who could tolerate the fact that their country had fallen into the hands of outsiders? When he thought up to here, Enchanting couldn't help but feel heartfelt sorrow. Why was Yang Tao so daring? It was because Nanxing was already destroyed. If the four factions of Nanman had not destroyed Nanxing's country, how could a mere Yang Tao, a mere duke, be able to strut around in Nanxing? Seeing Enchanting's silence, Lu Zhang could more or less guess what was going on. He sighed and said, "My lord, this matter is already a foregone conclusion. Our greatest threat is not Yang Tao. No matter what, Yang Tao was a pure-blooded Han man. It was better for Nanxing to fall into his hands than to be trampled by the four factions of Nanman." Enchanting pulled himself together and suppressed his grief and indignation. Lu Zhang was right. His greatest threat was not Yang Tao, but the four factions of Nanman that had been wreaking havoc in Nanxing. Enchanting said, "Thank you for your guidance, military counselor. Otherwise, I would have been stuck in a dead end." Lu Zhang declined humbly. He could see clearly that although Enchanting said that he had thought things through, he still disliked Yang Tao's actions. "I have something to discuss with you, my lord." Enchanting said, "Military counselor, feel free to speak your mind. I will support you with all my might." Lu Zhang said, "I wish to send someone to discuss an alliance with Yang Tao." The moment he said this, Enchanting's expression darkened. "Military counselor, what do you mean?" Lu Zhang said, "Yang Tao is an outsider at the end of the day. He looks powerful, but he is actually full of hidden dangers. If the two families work together, we can complement each other's strengths." Even though Lu Zhang had already thought of a way to help Enchanting's plan, Enchanting's foundation was weak. It would be too slow for him to plan alone. Yang Tao's strengths were obvious, but so were his weaknesses. It was the same for Enchanting. If the two families worked together, they might be able to complement each other's strengths. Enchanting helped Yang Tao integrate completely into Nanxing's power, while Yang Tao helped Enchanting further expand his influence. Enchanting was exasperated. He asked, "You can ally with anyone. Why must you choose Yang Tao?" This time, it was Lu Zheng's turn to be silent. What could he say? To tell the truth, he had hurt Enchanting's pride. Enchanting wanted to ally with someone else, but that person did not care about his meager resources. On the other hand, Yang Tao's power was neither too big nor too small, and he was an outsider. His overall strength was about the same as Enchanting's. If he allied with Yang Tao, the two families would have about the same say. This would be beneficial to both sides. After a while, Enchanting calmed down. He comforted Lu Zhang gently. Lu Zhang was what he relied on to rise up and take revenge on the four factions of Nanman. No matter what, he could not provoke the other. "This matter, I'll leave it to Shaoyin to handle." If an alliance was beneficial to him, Enchanting would accept it even if the partner was Yang Tao. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." Lu Zheng's lips curled into a sneer, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Instead, a flash of disappointment flashed through them. Under Lu Zheng's mediation, Yang Tao and Enchanting's forces formed an alliance. For the sake of territory and benefits, the feudal lords of the world fought until their heads bled. Zhang Pengji, who was far away in the northern borderline, was also slowly reaping her spoils of war. She led the army with Yi River as the boundary and advanced toward the northern borderline, occupying several horse farms and tribes. The battle at Yi River directly caused great damage to the northern borderline, and they fled upon hearing the news. The scale of the flood was too great, and it came too suddenly. The tribes and horse farms along the coast were almost completely destroyed, and the northern borderline suffered countless losses. The weather was hot, and the corpses of Wu Liba and the Ninth Prince began to rot and stink within a few days. Report: there are thousands of herdsmen blocking the way ahead. The messenger hurriedly sent the news to the main tent of the central army. Thousands of herdsmen? Zhang Pengji frowned. What are they trying to do? She was not bloodthirsty, and the war was definitely against the regular army of the northern borderline. As long as the ordinary herdsmen behaved themselves, she would not deliberately kill them. Li Yun followed. He frowned and said, "Those herdsmen voluntarily sought refuge with the Lord." Voluntarily sought refuge? Zhang Pengji raised her eyebrows. Look at your unhappy expression. It doesn't look like a good thing. What conditions did they offer? If they were sincere in seeking refuge, Li Yun would definitely show his joy on his face. But now he frowned. It was obvious that it was not as simple as seeking refuge. As expected, Li Yun said, the leaders of the herdsmen's tribes made a request. They are willing to pledge allegiance to us, but we have to hand over Wu Liba's corpse. Wu Liba's corpse? The entire tribe came to seek refuge. Is there really nothing fishy going on?
Li Yun said. From what I can see, it seems to be the case. Every family has brought along their entire family. If it was a trick, they would definitely not have brought along their relatives and children. What do they want Wu Liba's corpse for? Li Yun said. The leader of the small tribe said that he hopes to return Wu Liba to the embrace of God as soon as possible, so that he can have a more dignified death.
Chapter 992. The entire tribe surrendered just to collect Wu Liba's corpse? Hearing Li Yun's words, the expressions of the people in the tent varied. Some were indifferent, some could not bear it, and some were deeply moved. Although Wu Liba was their enemy, there were still people who remembered him after his death. Wu Liba's life was not in vain. Zhang Pengji looked at Li Yun and asked plainly, "That's their only request?" Li Yun cupped his fists and replied, "Indeed, that's their only request." In the beginning, Li Yun also thought that the small tribe wanted to strike a stone with an egg, but they brought along their families, men, women, young and old, and even infants sleeping in swaddling clothes. Li Yun sent someone to negotiate and ask for their intentions. Hearing their request, he was stunned on the spot. It was not unusual for the entire tribe to surrender. What was unusual was their reason for surrendering. At that moment, Li Yun felt some envy towards Wu Liba. If he was in the same situation as Wu Liba, would there be someone who would give up everything just to get his corpse back? "My lord, should we agree to this?" Li Yun saw that Zhang Pengji did not respond for a long time and could not help but ask. Zhang Pengji said in a low voice, "Agree to it. Get someone to collect Wu Liba's corpse and prepare a better coffin for them." To her, Wu Liba was just a stumbling block that she had kicked away. To the herdsmen of the northern borderline, Wu Liba was probably a hero or even a religion, and they were willing to give up everything for him. From the side, it could be seen that Wu Liba was worthy of respect. Since someone was willing to protect his corpse, why not agree to it? Speaking of this, Zhang Pengji suddenly thought of the ninth prince. They did not say what to do with the ninth prince's corpse?
Li Yun recalled carefully and said with certainty, "They did not mention the ninth prince."
Forget it, buy one get one free. The ninth prince's corpse can be considered as a bonus and sent over. As for how they deal with it, that's up to them. Zhang Pengji revealed a faint smile of mockery. The ninth prince was really a failure. Yes, I will do it now. Li Yun cupped his fists and retreated. As he walked, his armor made a crisp sound. Li Yun left and the audience regained their senses from this brief interlude. Mantion is a small white cloud. Old Wu's death was not a loss. A tribe was actually willing to surrender for him? Bao Bao Lai Kai Tang. Although Old Wu's death was tragic, there were still people who remembered him after his death, which meant that he was not a failure. Guzi Xiao Yu gone. TSK, you guys are really sentimental. Don't think this is so good. Maybe this tribe is the streamer's army. Even an idiot would know what the host's reputation in the northern borderline was like. The northern borderline would definitely say that the host was a butcher who killed people like scything flax, threatening the people in their territory. However, it was also possible for ordinary people to surrender in order to survive and protect their young and old. Bad mouse again. Sigh, am I the only one who feels sorry for the ninth prince? The prince is Liangzi's army. The audience in the streaming room sighed. Some felt that Wu Liba had died a worthy death, some pitied the ninth prince for dying quietly. Some reminded Zhang Pengji to be careful of the northern borderline's fake surrender, and some continued to be onlookers. There were too many viewers in the streaming room, and there were also too many bullet screens. Zhang Pengji could only block the bullet screens frequently. Li Yun instructed his subordinates to collect Wu Liba's corpse, wipe off the tainted blood, change into clean clothes, and then place it in a pitch-black coffin. As for the rotting corpse of the ninth prince, Li Yun ordered someone to pack it up and send it over. When the herdsmen of the small tribe saw the coffin, they hugged each other and cried bitterly. Their sobs were filled with endless sorrow. After crying enough,
the chief of the tribe took the initiative to surrender, and the herdsmen behind him all performed the northern borderline's ritual of submission. Has the Lord thought about how to settle these people? The tribe was not big. There were no more than 10,000 men and women, old and young, but there were about 5,000 young adults. If they were allowed to stay in the main camp, it would be hard to guarantee that they would not turn traitor at the last minute. When the time comes, they would collaborate with the northern borderline from both inside and outside, which would be a disaster instead. Rather than leaving them on the battlefield and becoming a hidden danger, it was better to send them back to Chongzhou and other places in batches. Zhang Pengji had also considered this point. She said, "Let's leave this matter to Wen Zhang. These people surrendered voluntarily, so we can't treat them like ordinary captives. How about this? Send someone to register them, then send them to the administrative areas in batches, one household as a unit. That's good too, to prevent any setbacks on the road to victory." Qiguan Rang furrowed his brows. How about this? Let them follow the grain team back to Chongzhou. In order to ensure the safety of the grain transportation route, the return journey was different. Letting these herdsmen follow the returning grain team to Chongzhou would not only prevent the exposure of the grain transportation route, but also reduce the expenditure of additional manpower. Before the tribe chose to surrender, they were already prepared for the worst, but in the end, they were told that they would only be sent to the Central Plains. Everyone looked at each other, their tensed nerves finally relaxed. There were even some women from the northern borderline who were carrying their children and secretly cried tears of joy. They carefully placed Wu Liba's corpse in a proper place and managed to arrange a decent funeral. Apart from this small interlude, Zhang Pengji's army advanced like a hot knife through butter, following the Yi River all the way to the north. The northern borderline had a vast territory. Its overall surface area was only 20 to 30% smaller than Dongqing. However, most of the land in the northern borderline was not suitable for human habitation, so the population was not abundant. The number of commoners was only 1/10 of that of Dongqing. The total population was less than 2 million people, which was considered sparse. In the battle between Zhang Pengji and the northern borderline at the Yi River, the number of people who died in the war and those who drowned in the flood had exceeded 150,000. If the people who were captured by Zhang Pengji and those who surrendered voluntarily were included, the total loss of the northern borderline was close to 200,000. This number was shocking and ruthlessly poked the eyeballs of the nobles of the northern borderline. Just thinking about it made their hearts ache. Faced with the approaching enemy, the tribes of the northern borderline had different thoughts, but in the face of disaster, they had no choice but to join forces. Although they had joined forces, they were not on the same page. On the day of the Yi River's flood, Wu Liba led the troops to cover the rear, while the eldest prince and the third prince led the main force to escape. At last count, they had less than 10,000 troops. Even though there were injured soldiers who returned one after another, the total number of troops was only 15,000, and many of them were disabled. They did not have military supplies and rations, and the troops under them did not even have much combat power. In the northern borderline, they could only be considered as the weakest. When the major forces of the northern borderline gathered, they did not even have the right to speak. Instead, they were reduced to minor characters. With the support of Wu Liba, the third prince became the acting king. But this acting king was not recognized by the others. Faced with the pressure of the strong troops, the first thing they thought of was not how to defend against the enemy, but how to squeeze together and elect the acting king. Chapter 993. You're still thinking of fighting for power when the strong army is here? He was just a substitute king. If the northern borderline was gone, the substitute king was nothing. The third prince's words sounded like he was showing off and ridiculing them. Third brother, it's easy for you to say that. You've been a substitute king, so of course you can say that, but we haven't. The third prince had been a substitute king. Although it was only for a few days, he was better than the other brothers. The third prince's face turned green and white, and he almost spat out the blood in his chest. If the teacher was watching from heaven and saw the northern borderline and the scene of internal strife, what would he think? The third prince said, "Aren't you letting Lu Shi take advantage of you?" The other brothers' faces turned cold. Some were dismissive, some secretly rolled their eyes, and some sneered. The meeting ended on a bad note. The prince's military strength was almost equal, and no one could defeat the other with an overwhelming victory.
The third prince walked out of the tent in a daze, followed closely by his brother, the fifth prince.
"Third brother, don't blame me for my harsh words."
The third prince turned his head to look at his younger brother, who had tricked him.
If the fifth prince had not held him back, perhaps he would have become the king of the northern borderline with the support of Wu Liba.
How could the idiot ninth prince have the chance to trap hundreds of thousands of northern borderline warriors?
If he had been the king from the beginning, the northern borderline would not have been tricked by Lu Shi.
Say what? The third prince asked coldly. We're all father's sons. No one is born lower than anyone else. The fifth prince looked around to make sure no one was around before saying, if you can be a substitute king, so can others. What right do you have to act like you've worked hard for the northern borderline to scold us brothers? I know what the other brothers are thinking.
They'd rather give it to an outsider than be taken advantage of by their own brothers.
The third prince's face turned pale. The fifth prince continued, you have no supplies and no food now. You're just living under someone else's roof. You'd better behave yourself. With that, the fifth prince walked away with his head held high, feeling unprecedentedly carefree. His third brother studied under Wu Liba. When he interacted with his brothers, he always put on an arrogant look.
He had long since found this person an eyesore. Now that he had ruthlessly crushed his spirit, there was no need to mention how carefree he was.
In addition to a few princes in the northern borderline, there were also other noble tribes. These people also had a lot of troops in their hands. The princes tried their best to rope in the nobles of the northern borderline to increase their own bargaining chips. In the end, the sixth prince won. After all, the sixth prince's mother's family was the most influential and had the most connections. After his successful victory, the sixth prince decisively reorganized his troops and gathered his advisors to give him advice. The quality of the advisors was uneven, and everyone had their own opinions. In addition, the rules of the northern borderline were not strict, so the main tent was as lively as a vegetable market. Some people felt that Jiang Pengji's previous victory over the north borderline was mostly due to luck.
There was nothing to be afraid of.
Some people felt that Wu Liba was too old, that he was not good at commanding troops, and that his mistakes in commanding were the root cause of the northern borderline's defeat. Of course, in addition to these two groups of people, there were also people who tried to smooth things over and sing praises. The third prince's face darkened after listening to them for a few days.
Haha! You idiots! If that Lu thief is really so easy to deal with, then I will be here to congratulate you on your early triumphant return.
After he finished speaking, the third prince directly flicked his sleeves and left. Seeing that, the first prince who was standing beside him also stood up and followed him. Third prince, aren't you giving others a handle by saying this? The first prince was exasperated and hurriedly stopped the third prince. Seeing that the person who came was the first prince, the third prince's expression softened slightly. It was probably because the two of them had gone through life and death together, so their relationship was better than before. What do you mean by giving others a handle? I'm just speaking the truth. They underestimated that Lu thief, and sooner or later, they will suffer a great loss. As the third prince said this, he could not help but think of his teacher who had taught him. His eyes became slightly wet. These people are really going to waste teacher's efforts. The first prince chose to remain silent. Compared to his few arrogant and unrestrained brothers, the first prince trusted the third prince's brains more. If the third prince's brains were not good, why did Wu Liba choose the third prince out of the 9 sons of the king of the northern borderline? What should we do? Watch them make mistakes? The first prince could not help but frown. He still had some self-awareness. He and the interests of the northern borderline were tied together. If the northern borderline prospered, he would be fine. If the northern borderline was unlucky, he would also be finished. If the northern borderline perished, Jiang Pengji would not let him off. The sixth prince is easily persuaded. Every time he hesitates, he likes to listen to the advice of the elders in the maternal family. One should never underestimate the abilities of the northern borderline's relatives. They were more powerful than the relatives in the Central Plains. They were very skilled at controlling puppets. Wasn't the sixth prince a puppet in the hands of the relatives in the maternal family? Without the help of the relatives, how could the sixth prince be the king? The third prince's face was full of worry. He said, now we can only take one step at a time. I hope they are not too stupid. At the same time, The third prince's angrily leaving also angered the sixth prince. The sixth prince exerted pressure on his advisors, forcing them to come up with a feasible battle plan as soon as possible. Needless to say, without pressure, there would be no motivation. After the sixth prince pressured them, the advisors indeed came up with a brilliant plan. Will this really work? The sixth prince hesitated. The advisor said, the traitor Lu previously accepted the tribes that surrendered. It shows that the other party is not very vigilant. The acting king can start from here and order a tribe to pretend to surrender and gain her trust. When the time is ripe, we can coordinate from the inside and outside. The traitor Lu will definitely be defeated. The sixth prince carefully considered the advisor's suggestion. The more he thought about it, the more likely it was. Finally, he made a decision and said firmly, "Okay, then let's do it." The advisor said, "I heard that the traitor Lu has many advisors and countless capable people around him. In order to avoid being seen through by the other party, the acting king needs to pay attention to some details." The sixth prince asked, "What details?" The advisor said, "I heard that the tribes that surrendered previously almost all surrendered with their families. Only then did the traitor Lu believe it. If the acting king wants to design a plan, we must follow it. Otherwise, I'm afraid it will be difficult to gain the trust of the traitor Lu. Instead, it will arouse the other party's suspicion." The sixth prince frowned, then suddenly relaxed his eyebrows. "Do as you say. If we can capture the traitor Lu alive, I will definitely give you a great credit. I will reward you with the title of nobility and 10,000 cattle and sheep." The advisor happily agreed. The third prince knew the sixth prince's plan and was a little surprised. It's not that they are completely brainless. The third prince thought about it. The feasibility of this plan was very high. Jiang Pengji had already accepted the tribes that surrendered, so her vigilance had already been lowered. At this time, if another tribe surrendered, she would not get to the bottom of it. She might be able to fool them. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.